Hello, and thank you for listening to Mapping the Zone, a podcast that is ordinarily dedicated to the informal discussion of the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. But you may notice that it is the beginning of a new month, and what that means around here in these parts, especially for those of you who select this episode to specifically listen to, I would presume this isn't playing on an FM radio somewhere, that you are not here to listen to talk about Thomas Pynchon, but instead are here to listen to talk about David Foster Wallace and his mammoth postmodern work, Infinite Jest. I am your host, the Feminized American.
And I'm just Cody, I guess.
Your inability to respond to that every single time I do it is probably 90% of the reason I keep doing it.
You know, when you mentioned FM radio, I should have said I was like Paul Harvey or something to throw people off.
There you go. This week we are going to be discussing how do I want to put, mammoth chunk of this book. If you thought that the last section was sort of full of important stuff, this section is significantly more so. You could almost just say that this section is the last section, but more so. As Wallace continues to develop his 3 different plot threads and reincorporate both themes and characters that we have already encountered prior to this section happening. And if that development engine, so to speak, kind of got spun up in the last 100 pages, it really sort of hits the turbo drive in these 100 pages. What did you think of these 100 pages?
I really like them. It's interesting because, like you said, it is more of a kind of a blowing out and looking more at specific parts of the story rather than, jumping from one to another. Where I guess in a way, what I'm trying to say is, like, in the previous sections, it's kind of felt more like a Robert Altman film or like early P.T. Anderson, where it's just like we're meeting all these people, we're cutting from one scene to another really quick. But now that's kind of slowed down, and we're getting more time in each of these scenes with these characters and developing more and seeing more of their interactions together and getting these important backstories. And it makes for really good reading. It also made it a section that I really had to kind of go back a couple of times and like reread sections to make sure I got things right, because I felt like I might have missed something. So it slowed me down, but in a good way. But I really enjoyed it. Very, very good section of this book.
Yeah, agreed. I think sort of, and to clarify, the section that we're talking about is page 306 through 410. That's what we're covering in this episode. And I think that probably the best way that I can think of to sum up my thoughts is it is the previous section, but only more so. And that includes all of the enthusiasm and passion I had for the previous section, but just sort of magnified. And in particular, it has a lot to do with the Boston AA segment, which is in this chunk of the book. It's the longest chapter, single chapter of anything in the book, from what I understand. And it really does feel like, as a writer myself, if I could ever write something that's even half as good as the Boston AA segment of this book, then I'll think I'll have been able to consider myself fairly successful. Because that is just such an incredible piece of writing from the perspective of kind of the world that it creates in that, 40 to 50 pages or however many it is.
Mm-hmm.
And the way in which it navigates through all of these different lenses that keep getting applied over the top of just this one concept of recovery is really, really crazy to me. In terms of how Wallace is able to pull that off from just a pure craft perspective, and getting to sit and read through that methodically, and especially on sort of a reread. And I would imagine, as I continue to reread this book for the rest of my life, subsequent rereads having even more connections that show up from earlier in the book to that one section. It's really something quite remarkable. So that really stands out to me as my favorite chunk of it overall. But just, it's between that and the Eschaton section, which a lot of people talk about as being their favorite, to just sort of the absurdity of Mario's film, which is more or less just a puppet show. There's there's a lot to like in these particular pages.
Yeah.
Did anything change for you from your first read to now? Did anything click or get altered by that?
I think I had more appreciation for the eschaton scene. I remember liking it the first time I read it, but it I think it kind of got lost in everything else that was going on, and me reading it at a regular pace, I think, kind of helped make that happen. So getting to slow down and read it in this shorter chunk of pages and really take my time to dissect it, like I really, really enjoyed that scene. And I would agree with you. I think that's probably for me the most entertaining scene to read in here in this section. The Boston AA scene is hands down the best of this 100 pages, 104 pages, whatever it is. It is, like you said, just phenomenal writing. I was blown away by it. It was I remember reading that particular section, and I was like, well, that's it for the day. I have to stop because I just need to let that all kind of sink in and soak in. And yeah, wonderful. Those two sections. Everything else in this is good, but those two particularly stood out to me a lot more this time than they did the first time through.
Agreed. Yeah. So this sort of grouping of pages is kind of broken up into a couple of major sections. It starts with a kind of conversation about this one particular student at ETA named Jim Trolch, who's not going to become a professional tennis player, but he is very interested in doing like the on-air announcing work for television, and how it is that he's already practicing that in the school. There's some absolutely amazing quotes from that section, especially as he starts to run out of the things that he can say
Yeah.
describe someone winning or losing a match.
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually this sort of transitions into a conversation about some more details about Mario's birth, which actually is kind of almost in a way like a backdoor way of introducing the mother, Avril and Candenza, as a more complete character, which then brings you into a pretty big footnote, the longest so far, of Hal and Orin having another conversation about the political aspect of the world as it is. And that will, of course, become more important towards the end of this section. But then after we get all of that, we are treated to another really important conversation between Marath and Steepley, but it's pretty short. And then we get the famous eschaton sequence, in which a game of eschaton is played, and the upperclassmen get high in front of everybody, and it turns into a complete and total disaster. And then after eschaton, that is when we are treated to the Boston AA segment of the book, which I don't know if you have any familiarity with AA or NA in a personal experience. I don't have any personal experience with NA, but I do with it. I'm sorry, with AA, but I do with NA. This is just a very accurate depiction of what those sort of groups are like, whether you're in Boston or not. Obviously, David Foster Wallace has familiarity with the Boston programs, because that was when he was kind of writing this book, or starting to write this book, was when he was in that area. It is an excellent sort of breakdown of what those organizations operate like. And then once we are through with that mammoth chapter, we eventually make our way to the Interdependence Day sort of, I guess you could say, tradition at ETA, in which everybody watches Mario's first film, which is, as I mentioned, a puppet show that is recorded to depict a fake, I guess you would say maybe cabinet meeting of the different states of Onan, talking about kind of this idea of the concavity or the convexity, depending on your political alignment, that has been brought up a couple of times in the book to this point, but never fully explained. So we get a lot of the sort of detail work filled in this section that we've been missing so far. And then we get some nice detail as well about the relationship between Mario and himself, all before these sections end. And you said your favorite was pretty much the Eschaton sequence?
As far as like just the pleasure of reading it, yeah.
Sure.
It's just it's really fun, and it's hilarious to think about these kids inventing a game like this.
Yeah.
And the just absolute absurdity of all of it. It felt very Wes Anderson-ish. Like if this were to be filmed in like a different style, different sections by different directors, I think Wes Anderson would have a great time with that particular scene. Especially with, everything that's going on and all the chaos and the sort of subtext of all of it and what it's supposed to be representing. And then you've got oh god, I can't think of his name off the top of my head now. The one that's kind of in charge of it, so to speak. Is it Pemulus? Yeah, he's wearing a beanie. Oh no, it's not Pemulus.
Otis P. Lord.
Otis, yeah, that's wearing the beanie, constantly spinning the propeller.
And they have different colored beanies in the drawer on the cabinet.
Oh, it's so funny.
So I don't think there's much worthy of talking about in the Jim Troeltsch section that isn't already going to kind of come up naturally with the stuff later politically. But there's just some really great humor in terms of depicting what the campus at ETA is like here. And also in kind of setting up, again, this intercontinental, maybe would have used to have been the term, conflict between the French Canadians and the Americans, and how that is representative even just in this one school environment. I do feel like we should treat the reader to the way in which Jim Troeltsch begins to change his sort of speech patterns for announcing these games. So on 308, if we want to do this just like paragraph by paragraph, I'll stop and then you can pick up for me if you want.
Sure.
The sports portion of Weta's broadcast is mostly just reporting the outcomes and scores of whatever competitive events the ETA squads have been in since the last broadcast. Troeltsch, who approaches his twice-a-week duties with all possible verve, will say he feels like the hardest thing about his intercom broadcasts is keeping things from getting repetitive as he goes through long lists of who beat whom and by how much. His quest for synonymous for beat and got beat by is never-ending and serious and a continual source of irritation to his friends. Mary Esther's exams were notorious no-brainers and automatics A's if you were careful with your third-person pronouns. And even while he listened closely enough to Troeltsch to be able to supply the audience feedback that tonight's dinner table would be inescapable without, Schacht was already on the test's third item, which concerned exhibitionism among the pathologically shy. 11-7's broadcast results were from ETA's 71-37 rout of Port Washington's A and B teams at the Port Washington annual thing.
John Wayne at A1 18s beat Port Washington's Bob Francis of Great Neck, New York 6-0-6-2, Troeltsch says, while A2 singles Howland Candenza defeated Craig Berta of Vivian Park, Utah 6-2-6-1, and while A3 KD Coyle went down in a hard-fought loss to Port Walsh's Shelby Van der Meer of Hempstead, Long Island 6-3-5-7-7-5, A4 Trevor the Axe Handle Axford crushed PW's Tapio Marti out of Sonora, Mexico 7-5-6-2.
And so on. By the time it's down to boys A14s, Troeltsch's delivery gets terser, even as his attempts at verbiform variety tend to have gotten more lurid. E.g., Lamont Chu disemboweled Charles Bobsilova 6-3-6-2. Jeff Penn was on Nate Millis Johnson like a duck on a June bug 6-4-6-7-6-0. Peter Beek spread Vil Dillard on a cracker like some sort of hors d'oeuvre and bit down 6-4-7-6, while 14's A4 Idris Arslanian ground his heel into the neck of David Weir 6-1-6-4, and PW's 5-man R. Greg Chubb had to be just about carried off over somebody's shoulder after Ted Postlethwaite moonballed him into a narcoleptic coma 4-6-6-4-7-5. It's so good, and I love that it just keeps interrupting what is supposed to be a narrative of Schacht taking a test. Just because it's constantly going on in the background noise of the classroom.
Yeah, I think
And
my
I think,
favorite of those
yeah,
is on 310, where while Gretchen Holt made PW's Tammy Taylor being sorry her parents were ever in the same room together.
yeah.
6063.
Or that one goes on with Ann Kitten playing grimaced and flexed her way to a 7.52663 win over Paisley Steinkamp. Right next to her, Jolene Crease at 6 was doing to PW's Mona Gent what a quality boot can do to a toadstool. 2-2. Oh man, it's really funny. So that then brings us to the kind of Mario and Avril section. Um, there is some really good stuff in the beginning here about Mario. I find it particularly interesting, given some of the other things that we have noted, that he is referred to as having an arachnoidal birth. I find that particularly interesting because both himself and his father were afraid of spiders, and there's this kind of through line of spiders as something to be afraid of, and Mario is certainly the exact opposite of what they were, in the sense that he is the kind of incandenza child who, to the degree that any of them is going to be able to like break this cycle of familial trauma and sort of non-communication. So it's a really interesting detail there. I do also really love a couple of details here on 312. The line a bit ragged from an afternoon of wild turkey and low temperature holography. James had thought Avril was dying right before his eyes. His own father had dropped dead on a set of stairs. Luckily, Avril's half brother Charles Tavis was upstairs, using the portable stairmaster he brought with him for an extended and emotional battery recharging visit the preceding spring. After the horrible snafu with the video scoreboard at Toronto Skydome, and he heard the commotion and scuttled out and down and promptly took charge. If that isn't like a metaphor for what the family dynamics are going to be as soon as himself, commits suicide, I don't know what is. So again, just good detail from Wallace in building out the kind of relationships that exist in this family. But then also where Mario gets his name from. Mario had been given the name of Dr. James Incandenza's father's father, a dour and golf-addicted Green Valley AZ occultist who made a small fortune just after Jim grew up and fled east by inventing those, quote, X-ray specs. It is interesting to me that he's named after the patriarch because he is the one, as we've kind of talked about, who is most capable of breaking the cycle, but he is also the youngest of the kids, if I'm not mistaken. Who and in their second youngest, I think it's Orin, Mario, and then Hal. If I'm not wrong, but anyway, not the firstborn. So not who you would typically kind of bestow with that sort of namesake in a traditional patriarchal sense. But it makes sense from Wallace's perspective to do that, given that he is going to be the one who is able to kind of lead the family emotionally in a different direction through the way that he is naturally. And then it continues on to mention a lot of other really interesting details just about how close he was with himself, and how there is like this both intense attachment from the other siblings in the family to him, but also a protection that really is the closest thing to any kind of genuine love that I think has been represented by the Incandenza family to this point in the book.
Yeah, Mario's a really interesting character, and for all the reasons that you just touched on. And I think we talked about this in one of the earlier episodes, that his physical deformities are never something that's made fun of or presented in any way that's supposed to make him like a lesser than kind of character. Like, he still exhibits so many qualities of his family's dynamic, both good and bad, but more so on the good end of things. Like, he's really, I think, the best representation of what himself could have been if he wasn't plagued with the plethora of issues that were behind his ultimate reason for taking his own life. But Mario, like you said, is definitely stepping into those shoes and filling in that role, and he does it all with this like almost boundless optimism for the world. Like he has this viewpoint, and I think he's kind of that's what makes him sort of a like an anchor point in the whole novel is that he is this sort of like there's always something good to look forward to, even as bad as things can be, and he's just always happy to be there and just happy to do his thing. And it's kind of one of those things where you kind of look at him and you're like, everybody should just live like that. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, and I think that one of the really smart things that Wallace does outside of the stuff that I've already mentioned is the way that this section ends with recounting the story of the person from the what is the order, like the hideously disabled or deformed people's association or whatever, comes to the campus to try and like pitch Mario on wearing a veil, and Hal sort of beats him away at tennis racket point. When we have another character who does wear the veil, right? Like in this way, him and Joelle are kind of put on the same level. Joelle is not able to handle what she sees as her deformity, which we'll get into at a later point in the book. And wears the veil and ends up getting addicted to a substance. And you have Mario, who through that kind of optimism or through that kind of connection that he is able to generate with other people, is protected from that sort of negative path. His ability to lean on other individuals for support, whether he maybe is fully aware of what he's doing or not, helps insulate him from these kind of negative aspects of life that the book is examining. And that is something that really unites Mario with Shact. We had an email a couple episodes ago from somebody who kind of mentioned the idea that like, well, Mario is somewhat of an ideal, but maybe his naivete is not. And there are aspects of his sort of, I don't want to call them a deformity, but he obviously does have like a learning disability probably, or something that does give him maybe a reduced capacity for thought. This is where I think Shact and him are kind of two sides of the same coin. They are comfortable relying on other people. They are comfortable forging connections with other people that are the same, and they're able to kind of figure out what just the right amount of something is as well for themselves. For Shact, it's the fact that he doesn't use drugs all the time. He maybe has a relationship to drugs that I was re-listening to an interview with Wallace the other day, and he describes Shaq's relationship to drugs in this interview as probably what the healthy adult consumption would be, where drugs are used as something to enhance daily life rather than distract from it. So I think that those two are really sort of in conversation with one another, and that specific element in which they're able to rely on or lean on other people for advice is really key to that. So within that that segment about Mario, there is footnote 110, which is our longest footnote yet by like a country mile. And this footnote does a couple of things. One, it establishes more of what the relationship between Orin and Avril Candenza is. And it also showcases how Orin is falling in love with Steeply, which is funny in and of itself. And that'll come back around in another footnote later in this section, and fills in some detail about the relationship between Onan and French Canada. What is your feeling around Avril? Because I remember when we talked about the Orin section, you seemed to have the perspective that Avril did genuinely have Orin's best interest in mind, which I don't necessarily agree with. So how would you kind of characterize Avril, or what would you kind of describe her as in terms of a character or as a mother?
So I remember saying that, and I think that was specifically in reference to something that she had said or done where she was whatever it was, it felt very like, I know you know what to do and what's right for you, and I'll support whatever that is, blah blah blah. As I've gone through more of the book, I do kind of start to see where that might not be the case.
Yeah.
And I thought I had highlighted something specifically related to that in here, but I'm not seeing that I actually did.
The portion that
Um,
you were referencing, I do remember it, was, um, in trying to get Oren to choose to go to Boston College so that she could get Charles Tavis to move to Enfield. Um, and she does that by saying, like, "I don't even wanna have anything to do with this decision, I already feel bad for suggesting it, like, I'm gonna run away now with my ears covered, so I don't know what you're thinking, and, like, you should
mhm.
feel." And, like, I think it's her type of manipulation is a particularly insidious type of manipulation
Yes,
because
and
she's able to code it in, like, an element of motherly concern that is plausible to believe in, essentially.
yeah, and I'm glad. So the manipulation, her being manipulative is absolutely correct, and that's something I guess I just didn't pick up on earlier, and or it shows how effective she is at manipulating people. That I mean, it kind of got through to me in that sense, and kind of kept me from seeing um how she really is. And I guess that's to Wallace's credit for developing her as a character in such a way.
You are also a parent, so I could see how
Yes.
maybe you would have similar thoughts to Avril, but maybe wouldn't vocalize them in the way that she does.
That's definitely true.
Yeah. Except I would imagine you're not trying to get your, your brother-in-law or your whatever sibling Charles Tavis's half-brother or whatever it
I
is,
think so, yeah.
in your thrall so you can start a incestuous relationship with him.
No, that has not been an issue I've had come up yet.
Um, so what do we make of her letter to Oren? First of all, the form reply, as shitty as it is, the form reply from the Arizona
Yeah.
Cardinals
Wow, that's
is
oh my god.
is the funniest fucking thing.
Yeah.
Uh,
I was almost in tears reading it. It was so good.
and I feel like there has to be a purposeful pinch on reference in that the, like, office clerk from the Arizona Cardinals who sends out these form replies is named Jethro Bodine.
Yeah.
Um,
That's Bodine is such a ubiquitous pinch-on thing.
yeah, exactly. So what did you make of her kind of letter to Oren? Because on the one hand, it is funny in that it tells us more about her, like, obsession with grammatical correctness, but um, that is certainly only one part of this letter that she sends to him.
Yeah, I think it just kind of highlights her, what is the word I'm wanting to use? Not fastidious, maybe. She is a very controlling, like, I feel like she has to have, like, control of every situation, and that while that can be, I guess, a good thing in certain situations, it also really works against people, especially when and I think that's a big part of her grammar thing is, like, having to be that person that's always, correcting other people for their grammars to the point where you have created an entire group, who have gotten so granular about doing it that it's the most obnoxious kind of behavior that you can really have. It's obnoxiously passive aggressive, I guess, is what it is.
Sure.
And that's, I think that really sums her up a lot as a character, is just that she is that um steadfast in having to have things this certain way. And it's not necessarily that, like, I kind of get where she's coming from. Like, people do misuse a lot of idioms and grammar and things like that, but it's not something that's, like, so bad that you need to go out of your way like that to have that kind of control on it. And it makes me kind of wonder, like, is, I guess, if, and unless I'm forgetting something that comes up later in the book too, is her manipulative control sort of drive part of what has fractured the family in the way that it is, aside from Mario.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because that letter is revealing in a way that isn't necessarily on its face revealing, in the sense that she's essentially narrating. So first of all, she's writing a letter that implies a response, which is in and of itself kind of already a fuck you in a
Yeah.
manipulative way of like, if okay, I'm just gonna have a one-sided conversation with myself if you're not gonna take the time of day to write me back. But then also, a bulk of the letter is her describing how she managed to convince a local grocery store to adopt her
Yeah.
sort of grammarial standards, which is, if you really strip that out to what she is communicating, it is, here's how I made someone else go my way. Um, Before then filling him in on stuff going on with Charles, who presumably is the whole reason why Oren is not talking to her anymore in the first place. Um, until eventually, at the very, very end, her dedicating like a couple of sentences to stuff that she's heard about Oren's life. Like that in and of itself, it is again just like a masterclass of manipulation that appears to be just sort of motherly concern. The way it's disguised is really quite insidious. To the point that I know that actually David Foster Wallace's mother was pretty upset with this character in the book. It was apparently a really his because so much of this is so autobiographical, and is essentially in a lot of ways kind of autofiction. His parents were very upset with the way in which the characters' parents were depicted in the book.
That's really funny. I hadn't considered that.
Yeah.
That really adds another element to the whole thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
And I think it's also really interesting that in the form letter that Oren sends back from the Cardinals, he doesn't even refer to her as Mrs. Incandenza. He doesn't even give her that title anymore. He refers to her as Miss Incandenza. Which is just, again, like another real just kind of twist in the knife moment back. So the two of them are very much evenly matched in the way that they're handling either side of this sort of faux correspondence. I also really would love to know how many signed photos at this point Averill has from the Arizona Cardinals.
Yeah. It's the level of pettiness between these two is almost admirable. Like,
yeah.
for both them to like continue butting heads like this and not just giving up. It's really good character work.
And it is important that they're both that way, because as we talked about in the first episode, Oren is the one sending copies of Infinite Jest out to people. He's the one who sent it to the medical attaché. We'll later learn that the reason why he's doing it is essentially out of revenge for the different people that his mom has cheated on his dad with, is essentially what it is. And he is kind of also a reprehensible human being. Like, and it isn't just his actions here, it is also the way in which this segment or this footnote transitions into a conversation between Oren and Hal that eventually becomes about Steeply and about politics, but starts with Oren talking about one of his seduction methods in which he pretends to be so devoted to a fictional wife that as soon as he convinces the woman to sleep with him, it acts as a compliment in his mind to the woman for managing to kind of take him away from the woman he loves so much. It's so gross. It really so is disgusting.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not pleasant to think
and
about that.
Yeah, and I love that Hal does not even give it the time of day and calls out how absolutely sort of revolting this behavior is midway through their phone call. And then does also give him some stick for not communicating with their mother anymore and becoming sort of superficially involved with the family, to say the least. There's, again, just some really good character work in expanding the dynamic between these two in this footnote. And then there is the inherent comedy of the fact that he is falling in love with a very poorly disguised man. It is one of my favorite subplots of this book, just from a sheer absurdity perspective. Because it's especially so funny in how it's structured because of the fact that up until this point, we have only had sort of Marath's perspective on how bad the disguise is, that the idea that it's fooling anyone is inherently laughable. But Oren is indeed falling in love, and Oren proceeds to ask Hal some questions about the conflict between the French Canadians and Onan that relate to the kind of political situation of the book. And I don't know that it's maybe necessary for us to recount all of that, because this podcast is very specifically designed to be listened to while reading the book. So understand, I guess, that the way Wallace is developing this conversation here, it is meant to fill in some of the backstory behind why there is such enmity between French Canada specifically and the United States. And that kind of comes to a head in these 100 pages with that final section. So it is important to kind of pay attention to, particularly in how it reveals that there is probably some degree of a deeper plan sort of in place for what the French Canadian separatists are working on. But it is ultimately going to come to a head in that final segment of these 100 pages.
I really love the conversations between Hal and Oren. I think
they're
some of my favorite parts of the book.
Yeah,
because it does such a good job of world building, which is something you don't really often think of when it comes to just literary fiction, because it tends to take place in a mostly recognizable America or what part of the world. But when you have a book that's set in the who knows how long from now future, it requires there to be a certain element of world building that takes place, and so that we can understand how things got to be the way they were. And that can be really clunky sometimes, which can really take a person out of the book. But having it set up like this is a really, really smart and innovative way to go about doing it. And it makes it feel very natural. It doesn't feel like it's kind of hammering you over the head with, here's how things got here, and, just lore dump kind of thing. It's a very natural and enjoyable way to understand how the world came to be the way it is.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, there's flying cars in this book, but you wouldn't really notice that unless you're just reading very closely, because it's not something that is to the characters worth commenting on. It's just part of sort of the existence that they have. I do also love the one detail that I do want to make sure I mention, the fact that the very first terrorist attack that the AFR does is just putting up a giant mirror, like a Looney Tunes sort of episode on a highway, to get people to just veer off the highway and crash. Yeah. And the only reason why they eventually discovered this is just because someone was so drunk while operating their vehicle that they didn't stop in time, and they just blew through the mirror. It's such a creative, while also being horrifying, idea for like a terrorist attack on another country.
Yeah.
One that I'm kind of surprised has never been tried in real life to some degree.
Yeah.
It feels like that could actually work.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things in this book that I don't want to say predicted necessarily, because they were technology that was kind of already developing, but I mean, hell, it talks like you basically have curbside grocery pickup in this footnote.
Yeah.
So, and that was something that was not an idea at all in 1996. So hats off to that, because that's pretty impressive. But yeah, there's a lot of, much like we talk about a lot with Pynchon and his sort of Looney Tunes-esque humor that occurs. I think also the Oren falling in love with Steepley, even though he's so poorly disguised as a woman, like it's very much a Bugs Bunny kind of thing. Like,
right?
It's Bugs Bunny in a dress. It should be obvious to everybody else, but Oren just can't he's just lost in his own little romantic situation.
We do also get another detail in this footnote that adds to the kind of scumminess of Orin, in that he specifically tends to target women with children, or tends to be attracted to women with children, which just makes it all the worse. Yeah, just a really good footnote overall with a lot of detail, certainly.
Yeah.
What is maybe the shortest section of the book so far, but that has the most sort of annotations in my copy that I've left in the margins, is this conversation between Morath and Steepley, which
It's
really, it's so good, and it also really lays out a lot of the broader concepts that Wallace was talking about in terms of looking at Infinite Jest as a particularly American book. Whereas I've said this line a couple of times, but he said in his interview with David Lipsky that if the book is about anything, it is about the question of why. Why am I watching all of this shit? Why am I so focused on this entertainment? And what is so American about that? That is really what these like 4 pages are.
Yeah.
Is a conversation about that. And I think the other interesting thing too, in this interview that I was listening back to today, he describes Morath as essentially a type of fascist. That he is talking about how America really needs a hand to guide it towards what it should be bowing down to or what it should be worshiping, and that it shouldn't be this society that has no master, and that in lieu of having something greater to kind of bow down or worship, what you end up doing is just basically worshiping yourself, right? And that is a very sort of inherently fascist concept if taken to its full conclusion. Because the full conclusion of that would be, okay, you need something to bow down to, I'll give you something to bow down to. And it's the party or the leader of the party. It's the Il Duce, or the Führer. And he has a really spooky moment in this interview where he talks about how it really feels like, with the direction that America's going in terms of entertainment or in terms of its consumption or its lack of a broader ideal to kind of bow down to use the book's term, that essentially we have become a country, as he puts it, that is ripe for fascism. And that's hard to listen to in 2026.
Gee whiz.
From an interview from 30 years ago. And it really feels like that is a case where that has kind of come true, that due to our lack of any sort of unified identity as a country, due to any kind of lack of unified struggle as a country, due to essentially too much comfort, too much choice, too much, to borrow another Wallacean phrase, unalloyed pleasure, we have ended up as this mass of people who have no broader thing to put our faith into or broader thing to kind of bow down to, so to speak, to make ourselves better. So what has happened is the people who are willing to bow down to somebody who speaks strongly at them end up bowing down to, a political movement that is essentially a slightly different version of fascism. And because when you have all of these spiritually disenfranchised people, you can't really form a coherent resistance to that too easily. It is just able to rise to power. I would highly recommend everyone watch the adaptation of the Antonio Scarlatti novel M, Son of the Century, that came out last year, because that really depicts how fascism in Italy came to power in a really, really interesting and artistic way, but it also does, I think, depict some of this stuff that Morath and Steepley are talking about, and that Wallace, sort of from beyond the page, was trying to talk about, in terms of how we end up with these types of political movements or these types of parties, or how our culture goes in that direction. And the last thing I'll say at the end of this very long-winded statement is that it is also interesting that Wallace views Morath as kind of a type of fascist, pushing towards this need for an identity or this thing to bow down to. And then we have the other character in Stitt, who runs the tennis academy, who is essentially a fascist as well. So again, it's how these different aspects of, as we talked about last week, the Sierpinski gasket, are related to one another. And this is one of those. It's this idea that like you can put an element of control or an element of giving yourself up over to something. If you push that to a certain degree, you can end up essentially with a type of fascism in one way or another. And it is, again, to reuse the same phrase from earlier in this episode, it's about finding the right amount. It's about becoming the Shaft or becoming the Mario, essentially. But this conversation between the two of them is incredible. What is your feeling on it?
Yeah, I'm the same way. Like you mentioned, having probably more annotations in this section than any other in this chunk of the book that we read, and I have like set off huge chunks of this of speeches and just lines that they have, and it's one of those. You said very well, and I was unaware of this interview that you were talking about with Wallace about Morath basically being a fascist. Like I hadn't really fully considered that, but with that in mind and understanding his character up to this point and this particular chapter of the book, like that makes a lot of sense. And I think what's scary about it, especially, is with a lot of the things that he's saying, like he's not wrong. It's just that willingness to push it to the outer limits that he's willing to, like you mentioned, is what's scary about it. His dismantling of a lot of U.S. ideologies or lack thereof is spot on, and it's even more prescient in 2026. And I think that dynamic between him and his character and this sort of hardline, you have to see the world that you're really living in instead of just trying to pretend that these problems don't exist, versus Deeply, who is so willingly oblivious, you could even say, like ignorant of what's going on around him and disguising himself as someone else, and just kind of unwilling to meet reality in the face. So these conversations between them are so interesting to read, because it really, at times, especially when you're reading this book 30 years after it was written, really does sound like someone trying to talk to the average MAGA voter and just being like, do you not see this shit that is going on? And they're just like, well, I don't know about all that. And it just so oblivious to everything. And it kind of sucks to read, but at the same time, it's like, yeah, this is where things were going, and this is where we've kind of arrived at this point. And I as much as I love Morath as a character, like understanding that part of him now, like it really kind of changes the way I perceive him. I still think he's a great character. I don't think he's a good person.
Oh, there's no bad characters in this.
No,
this book.
They're all good characters. They're just, a lot of them are just bad people.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's there's so much about this section that we could spend another hour just talking about the different parts of this whole back and forth between them. It's incredible, and I love every time we have a conversation between. I think that's much like the Hal and Oren conversations. Like I think this is just such a good way to kind of introduce the way that the world has got itself into the point that it is.
Yeah, the next time I read this book, I think I'm going to go for the chronological reading of it, where that's going to cause you to like skip all over the place, of course.
Yeah,
but one of the aspects of it that I think is going to be really rewarding is just reading Morath and Steeply's dialogue back to back, just because it's essentially all one long conversation that they're having.
To get the uninterrupted version of that would be really cool.
Yeah, just because it is significantly interesting dialogue that, to me, especially now that I'm older, a lot of the drug stuff, especially having gone through an addiction myself, has become more relevant to me. But when I was younger and when I read this book for the first time, this was the stuff that I found most compelling. And I still think it's intensely compelling, and I think it's that portion of the book has actually gained more relevance since then. I'll ask you if you have any quotes that you want to read from this section, but one of them is that I had was on 318, where it says, Marath shrugged. Us, we will force nothing on USA persons in their warm homes. We will only make available entertainment. There will be then some choosing to partake or to choose not to. Smoothing slightly at his lapsed blanket. How will USAs choose? Who has taught them to choose with care? How will your offices and agencies protect them? Your people? By laws? By killing Quebecois? Marath rose, but very slightly. As you were killing Colombians and Bolivians to protect USA citizens who desire their narcotics? How well did this work for your agencies and offices? The killing. How long was it before the Brazilians replaced the dead of Colombia? When I'm talking about relevance, like, and I'm aware that this is not a mind blowing comparison to make, but but TikTok is essentially the entertainment from this book.
Yeah.
Especially the way in which the kind of TikTok method of video creation has taken over each individual platform, where you have like YouTube Shorts, you have Instagram Reels. I would imagine something is on Twitter, but I don't go there.
I mean, it's all just short form media. That's all it is.
Yeah, it's all just short form media that's mindless, to your point, but then also is specifically designed for you to keep scrolling, just to like continue to watch and watch and watch and watch and watch. And I don't think anyone has died of, over ingestion of TikTok, but it is doing something that is incredibly similar to the entertainment or drugs, as the metaphor of this book becomes clearer the further into it you get. And it's especially important because in this book, the entertainment is being prepared to be used as a political weapon. And like TikTok, it's spyware that very easily siphons data out of your phone and could be used for propagandistic purposes if they wanted it to be. And that's like not hidden information.
No,
like TikTok's origin and its dubious connection to the Chinese government, and in particular the Chinese military, is very public information and has been for years. But people still choose to use it anyway. It is still like a significantly oversaturated form of media and content consumption, despite the evident risks of that. It's a little bit different of a risk than what exists in Infinite Jest, obviously, but the point is the same. They made it available, and people chose to engage with it. It's no different than what Marath is talking about here.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and it's something that I've, as a parent, like I have kind of gone on lectures with my kids about that, like trying to explain to them that it's the dumbing down of not just America, but a lot of the world in general, has just been this sort of slow march into where we are now. Like this acceptance of short form media that people understand when you make it, that you're willingly giving up your information. You are engaging in this content that really serves no purpose. And I hate to say that, but that's the general reality of a lot of this kind of media, is that it has no purpose other than obtain views and get numbers. So I try to explain this to them and tell them, like, engage with things that are at least making you think about something. There's nothing wrong with watching a video on YouTube. There's something wrong when you're watching someone else tell you how you should think about something. But there's plenty of good discussion and discourse that exists out in the internet. It just gets buried in all the easy fast food versions of media that are on there. And it's a thing that is caused so much damage and is so ingrained now. I don't know how we can come out from it.
Yeah, I don't know what it is either. It would need to be like some sort of mass dissemination of the antidote to the entertainment, like it's talked about in the book. I remember, like, I had a drug problem. I'm sure I'll talk about that very shortly. Um, I remember when I first started to get off of the internet. I now have one of those brick devices that are kind of being advertised a lot online now, where you can just uh, NFC tap your phone against it, and it'll shut like a bunch of different functionalities of your phone off
Oh, yeah,
that
yeah,
that
yeah.
you set. I think it's great. Um, because I have a job where I can't really have a flip phone, even as much as that is honestly just my ideal. That's what I would prefer. Um, and I remember when I first did that, even though I was never a big social media user, I was mostly off of social media entirely. Um, my primary sort of media addiction was to YouTube more than anything else. Um, that I would just kind of sit there and like perseverate over the fact that I felt like I needed to be doing something. Um, and that is not unlike detoxing from a substance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It is very, very similar. Were there any quotes from this section that you wanted to specifically read out?
Yeah, especially with what you had mentioned earlier about Morath and the way Wallace described him in the interview. This is on 320. Morath's chair squeaked slightly as his weight shifted. Always with you, this freedom for your walled up country, always to shout freedom, freedom, as if it were obvious to all people what it wants to mean, this word. But look, it is not so simple as that. Your freedom is the freedom from. No one tells your precious individual USA selves what they must do. Is this meaning only, this freedom from constraint and forced duress? Morath, over Steeply's shoulder, suddenly could realize why the skies above the coruscating city were themselves erased of stars. It was the fumes from the exhaust waste of the moving autos, pretty lights that rose and hid stars from the city and made the city Tucson's loom nacreous in the dome's blankness of it. But what of the freedom to? Not just free from. Not all compulsion comes from without. You pretend not to see this. What of freedom to? How for the person to freely choose? How to choose any but a child's greedy choices if there is no loving filled father to guide, inform, teach the person how to choose? How is there freedom to choose if one does not learn how to choose? That I remember reading that and going, wow, that's fucked up. But he's kind of like, I see where he's coming from,
Mhm.
but it's the most Ayn Randian bullshit that you can really spout out of your mouth. Um, and yeah, to your point, it is very that is how fascists get into power is by like, this idea of like you don't know what you want. You can do whatever you want, but you don't know what that is. So I'll tell you what it is, and then
Mhm.
you're free to do that thing. And it creates this sort of false sense of freedom that exists. And then that's how you can get people to turn and say that, oh, anybody who's trying to fight that is fighting against the ability to be free because they've bought into this snake oil sales that, you know, the idea of being free from oppression is stripping a person of their freedom to do things or just not giving them that option. And it's a brilliant form of deception.
Yeah.
But it is very evident that that's what Morath is getting at. And I just hadn't picked up on that, but that totally changes a lot of my reading about this now.
Well, and that's what makes it so interesting to me, because the last line, "How is there freedom to choose if one does not learn how to choose?" Like that is still true even if your aims are not fascist.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
like obviously Marath is at the end goal there is some kind of, fascistic ideal according to Wallace himself. But um that in and of itself is an illustration of how you're going to be able to choose correct if you don't know how in the first place. Like if you have no ability to know how to choose the decisions for your leaders, for your personal life, for the way you spend your time, whatever the case may be, then you're probably going to end up choosing wrong, or at the very least, the likelihood of you choosing right goes way down. So it is that really brilliant deception, and again, if we're talking about structure, pretty intelligent that this comes after the stuff with Avril and Orin, which is all about deception.
Yep.
It is that really intelligent deception where it is that kernel of truth. But if you follow this guy specifically, he's going to lead you down a pathway that's not going to be great. Um, and it is again to loop back to Mario and to loop back to Shact. These are elements of people who have learned how to choose, right? Shact knows how to choose when and when not to partake in drugs. Shact knows that he's not going to be a tennis professional, and he's chosen something else for his life. He's done that work. So that this idea of how to choose and what you're choosing is incredibly fundamental to the book. And he's done it twice now in these two different elements of the gasket, where if you find yourself agreeing with either Gerhard Stitt at the tennis academy, who's a fascist, or Marath here on the mountain, who's a fascist, there may be some need for you to examine what that is. And I think if I'm going to go real, like, big-headed with it, I think some of that loops back into David Foster Wallace's critiques of postmodernism. If you go back to, like, our very first episode where we talked mostly about Wallace as an individual rather than the book, he points out this idea that postmodernism eventually became something that only was cynical and ironic and cut against and critiqued, but didn't offer anything else in its place. I think there is something similar here in these sort of fascist elements of characters critiquing, particularly with Marath. He's critiquing, but he's also not providing any context for how one should learn how to choose in the first place. There is no alternative suggested at any point. And that was really kind of where the rubber met the road of Wallace's criticism of postmodernism, that it critiqued, but it didn't offer anything in replacement. I guess maybe the best way to talk about Eschaton is... do you want to explain what the game is? And then I guess I'll explain maybe a brief what happens in this portion, and then we can talk about philosophically what Eschaton is.
So, from what I can gather, it is, and correct me at any point if I am wrong, because this is only my second time going through it, and it's a lot to kind of try to gain a grasp of. But it is basically the kids at the camp, who have created what is essentially a nuclear war simulation via tennis, and everybody basically has a role to play as a different country or a different element of power, and then you have someone who's kind of in charge of overseeing everything to make sure it's like Model UN, but with tennis balls as missiles. And that's really the best way I can describe it. And then there's always whoever's like the head person in charge has to wear one of many colored beanies, depending on what the situation calls for, because there are appropriate situations that have specific beanies that are needed to be worn. And there's a propeller. It's fucking hilarious. It is, like I said, it's so entertaining to read. It's just funny as hell.
Yeah, it's essentially a war game at the highest level because it involves like a fucking damage calculator program on the computer.
Yeah, being run around on the court.
Yeah.
on a cart.
And we're given a footnote about how that damage calculator works and the kind of description. This is like Pemulus's sort of bread and butter. He was the best Eschaton player as a junior, so now he kind of oversees it as a senior. But it's mostly played by the underclassmen. And as far as what happens in the section, the upperclassmen sit on the side of a hill overlooking the court, getting high. Hal momentarily forgets that he likes to get high in secret, and so gets high in public, which is a huge problem for how the episode unfolds. And essentially, when they take a break in the game to calculate a peace plan, and as well as like figure out where they need to shuffle stuff around on the actual sort of computer simulation aspect of it, one of the players takes it upon himself to attack one of the other players directly, which represents a complete violation of all of these like carefully ordained rules and ideas that Pemulus has made sure to teach to Otis P. Lord, who's taking over from him as the game master. And then all hell breaks loose, and Otis gets his head colliding with the actual computer. One of the students gets absolutely pelted into oblivion with tennis balls. And, something tragic essentially befalls everybody who was playing the game in the first place.
Yeah.
And it is crucial that the upperclassmen, other than Shact, do not intervene. they basically sit there stoned as it is their little buddies too. It's like the specific kids that they're kind of in charge of shepherding, who completely ruin not just the game, but also in some cases like their health to play in upcoming tournaments, and do nothing to kind of guide them or provide them any sort of direction. It's a complete failure of sort of leadership on their part, is essentially what is happening in terms of the literal story there. Beyond that, there's a lot of philosophical ground that Wallace is working as it relates to the map not equaling the territory, responsibility, good judgment, and so much more. I mean, this is something that like people obsess over this portion of the book in particular, and I thought it was longer. I remember from the last time that I read it to this time, I really felt like it was longer than it is. Like, it is a long segment of the book, but it doesn't go on forever. You can read the Eschaton portion in probably like an hour or so, whereas the Boston AA portion of this book, you could spend a whole day reading that, depending on where your actual sort of level of reading speed and comprehension is. So, I guess before I talk for an incredibly long amount of time, most likely, what is it that you see Wallace is using the Eschaton section for? How do you kind of interpret it philosophically? What is he trying to get at in providing this sort of game as sort of a bonus quote from my wife, who is a school teacher? She says that it is about how things involving children tend toward chaos, which she said half sort of jokingly, half serious, but that is genuinely sort of what is also happening in this portion.
Yeah.
So shout out to you, Allie. Love you. I know you're listening to this.
As a new teacher myself at the elementary level, that's 100% correct.
Yeah.
It is. I don't know that I have grasped fully what Wallace is getting at as far as like the philosophical base of all of this, but it to me at least reads as there's a sort of inherent inability for a large group of people to ever fully work together cooperatively in a way that would lead to any form of unity or peaceable living. It is certainly possible up to a certain point, and then you reach a critical threshold at which all hell breaks loose, and it just descends into madness. And this operating as what is essentially putting a model UN club skin over a LARP game, kind of it illustrates how quickly those kind of things can devolve. Everyone has their own self-interest. Everyone has the thing that they're working towards and doesn't want to give up any direction of it. And then you have people who just want to be assholes. And all of these people are working in tandem, both for and against each other simultaneously. And when you throw in an insane amount of acronyms that I don't really know that they're explained what they all mean.
You're talking about like the different factions?
Yeah, like the Sac Pop and the Savoir and Amnet and all of that. Like it creates this chaos that just lends itself to watching a series of car wrecks essentially happen in real time, and ends with a kid reenacting a scene from The Godfather but with tennis balls. It's again, this is only the second time I've read it, so I'm sure there's a lot that I am missing within here, but it definitely has that feel of just like, this is why we can't have, to put it on a global scale, this is why we can't have nice things, because nobody can fucking get along, and at the end of the day, it just explodes.
Yeah. Another random detail that I want to make sure I mention is that there's a line on 327 that says uninitiated adults who might be parked in a nearby mint green advertisorial Ford sedan. That's steeply. So it's another sort of element of how the kind of political stuff is closing in. If you remember from a couple episodes ago, I made mention of this because I forgot to mention it in the moment when we were recording the episode, but he is described as having a mint green Ford sedan that is covered with advertisements. I think it's for a dental office or a toothpaste. So even their vehicles are subsidized. So he's watching all of this eschaton stuff kind of carry on. And the only person who notices is Shact. He's the only one who's like, who's that car at one point in this portion of it, or it's noted that he regards that it's there. So I want to make it clear before I talk about this that I don't think all of this philosophical stuff that Wallace is doing on the idea of the map versus the territory is necessary for you to understand the book in its entirety. The only thing that I think you really need to understand from this section of the book in terms of the character arcs as it relates to the kids at the tennis academy is the fact that Hal's addiction has reached a point where, despite his good faith efforts earlier in the book that depict him trying to be a good mentor for his little buddies, that the drugs have now gotten in the way of that, essentially. That when chaos started, he absent-mindedly got high and wasn't able to intervene. And that will set up disciplinarian stuff from the academy later in the book, particularly as it relates to Pemulus. But Hal is not free from that. So I think that in reading this portion, that is really all that the reader needs to take away. That Hal's drug use has reached a point now where it is altering the way that he behaves in maybe not a moral way is the right way to put it, but in a very substantive way. It isn't just that he wants to get high anymore or that he enjoys the secrecy of it. It is now affecting his personhood. But as far as all of these sort of philosophical stuff, I've used that word a couple of times. It is this analysis of false maturity and actual maturity, and then the idea of this difference between the map and the territory. So the false maturity and actual maturity is best expressed through this element of how there is all of this structure and rigor and work that the academy puts into these kids to try and essentially teach them how to deal with the pressures of a professional tennis career or the pressures of being an adult early enough that they can be adjusted to it by the time they make it to the show, if they make it to the show. And that is an attempt to inculcate a degree of sort of adult behavior or adult maturity that should make things like this impossible. The big buddy, little buddy system is a part of that, obviously. But when the rubber meets the road, these are still just teenagers at the very most and children at the very least. So if you're expecting those people to be able to behave as if they are significantly older or significantly more developed in their understanding of the world around them and their place in it, that is not going to be successful long term for almost any of them. And that comes out in ways like this. And I think that the intensely rigid nature of the game, in terms of you need all of these different beanies, you need all of this computer equipment that calculates everything, you can only do certain things, in terms of how you can lob the balls, what you can attack, how much you can attack. It's an incredibly complicated game, is meant to mirror that aspect of the academy, being this incredibly rigid, big environment that is trying to push people towards greatness at a very high level, but it is ultimately still children. And to expect children to be able to adapt to that sort of, as we've mentioned a couple times, almost fascistic environment, and for them to not be children is just silly. Same with the idea that, like, in this game, the stakes are incredibly high. The stakes of the academy are also incredibly high. It could mean a professional tennis career. The stakes of the game is the end of civilization. It's a nuclear war simulator.
Mm-hmm.
And you still have children at the wheel of that. So expecting them to act like anything other than children is silly. The idea that someone hadn't attempted to do what the character does at the end of this game and just attack one of the other players is it's crazy that it didn't happen before then. So I think that is one part of it, and then to kind of remove it from that context specifically, it is the question about the map and the territory. Pemulus yells about the idea of the difference between the map and the territory a lot in particular. So it's clearly something that Wallace wanted us to consider about how these things are different from one another, in the idea that, like, and it's hard to talk about this stuff, so I only know how to talk about this stuff in a really academic way because I have a minor in philosophy from college. So, like, I think the best way for me to translate it in an easier way is this understanding of how just because things are set up a certain way does not necessarily mean that they're going to go a certain way, I guess, in like a systematic perspective. You know, what ends up leading to the chaos is actually the fact that there are not enough rules, and that there is nothing in the rule book after Otis P. Lord consults it that would invalidate the strategy that is used. And then, you know, Kitten Plan retaliates as a result of that. You know, if you were to look at that in a real war scenario, there are rules for war, as stupid as that sounds.
Yeah.
There is the Geneva Convention, but countries break that all the time. There is a significant separation between the way that humans behave and the environment that we're put into. You know, we all have subjective experience despite going through sort of a similarity in human culture. We have laws, we have rules, people break those all of the time. Just because something is supposed to go a certain way doesn't mean it's going to go that way. You know, and there's a whole religious angle you can apply to this. Eschaton comes from the word eschatology, which is essentially the theological study of the end times. You can certainly also look at the way in which Otis P. Lord doesn't respond to the emergency that is happening as God essentially leaving his creation to destroy itself and not intervene. There's a lot of work that you can do in this section philosophically that relates very specifically to the context, but then also to the kind of more meta-textual level of just how humans act, is, I guess, the easiest way that I can think of to describe that. And so it is a microcosm of essentially this idea that, like, we are all born, you know, into a system that a lot of us will follow, but not everyone does. And just because that system exists doesn't mean that there aren't ways to pervert that system or change that system or expand outside of what is supposed to be the limit of something. That idea of map and territory, they are not equivalent to one another. I don't know if that makes any sense to you.
It does, yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
But I think that is really the bigger way that Wallace is using this section. You know, we make rules as human society. We also break them. Then we maybe pass new laws, or we maybe create new systems, whether that's AA, whether that is, you know, rigid athletic performance and achievement, to keep us from infringing upon those things, to protect something underneath it. It's kind of, it isn't dissimilar from the old biblical laws of the rabbinic Judaism that, like, Jesus preached against, where the Jews, to make sure they didn't break the interior rule, would create a rule around those rules. And so if you didn't break the outer rule, you couldn't break the inner rule. So as a result, you might have a Levitical code that says like you cannot lash somebody more than 40 times. And so instead of saying 40 lashes, it's 40 minus 1. So that way, if you're only counting to 39, it tends to also keep in context the idea that maybe you miscounted, maybe you forgot. So I think that the eschaton scene really gets into this idea that like we create systems, we create rules, we create laws, we break them, we try to create other systems to keep us from breaking those things. That doesn't work either. And then the weight of the system can grow to such a level that it comes crashing down on you. Not akin to the computer knocking out Otis P. Lord at the end of the sequence. That is very much like that system crashing down on him when all he was trying to do was administer it. And again, if we're talking about structural stuff, that gets into the AA segment after that, where that is very much like a strict, rigid system that you can exist in to help control your behavior, to help control your impulses, and as they will talk about, none of them know why it works. None of them are able to understand why AA works. It just does. So that is, I think, the broader philosophical context here. And then there is also a reading that some people will apply to it, in that if the ghost of himself is the narrator of the novel, he is also illustrating to Hal that there are circumstances around his death that are a little fishy, by making Otis P. Lord's head go into a monitor, similar to how his head went into a microwave, and how maybe that was a more orchestrated event than a random one. So that's another reading that some people applied to it. But that's my big thing on eschaton. I've been thinking about that for like the last week and a half, as far as how I can sort of break that down.
Yeah. So I want to bounce off the last point you made there about the idea of the novel, the narrator of the novel being the ghost of himself. I think I mentioned in an earlier episode that it felt to me like Hal is the narrator, and footnote 123, unless I maybe it's just a coincidence, but it seems to kind of almost confirm that, because that note specifically starts with Pemulus here dictating to the ink. So Pemulus is talking directly to Hal, or I guess it could be himself, and telling him the specifics of how this particular system works. But I thought that was interesting, and it was just an idea that I had that I didn't really have much in the way of like showing if that could be the case. But at that footnote, I was like, oh shit, okay, wow, maybe there is something to this. I don't know.
Yeah. I think the question is, in terms of who's narrating the book, is like, let's say for the sake of argument that it is himself's ghost, right? That line of like Pemulus here, dictating to ink, that could be the ghost saying, "I'm seeing Pemulus here," dictating what he's talking about to Hal.
Oh, okay, yeah.
That's so yeah, I think the question is the way in which the reader is given access both to the interior thoughts of characters and to all of these different places that Hal does not go. The Boston AA meetings, the meeting between Morath and Steepley, that the only way that you would have access to all of that would be from some kind of omniscient perspective, which the closest thing that this book gets to is these different wraiths that exist.
Interesting.
Anything else you want to talk about with eschaton specifically?
No, I mean, again, we could go on and on and on about that.
Yeah.
It's so well written, and like so much of the nuances and the details of it are so just good. Like, even if I don't get the full like physics of that where they're talking about physics of how things work, or how this is related to that, or this counts as this or that, like all of that can be really hard to track, especially on a second read. I'm sure the more I read it going forward, I can start to put those pieces together here and there. But the fact that he clearly spent the time to really develop this and make it kind of work, work in a way that it can't work, I guess is the better way to phrase it. Like
Yeah.
this again goes back to that world building thing of like, this is detail that a lot of other authors just would not have taken the time to put in because it's too much work. But the amount of understanding and context that it provides to what's going on in the grand scheme of things, like that, your whole explanation of the philosophy behind it makes so much of that make more sense. And so that's one of those things that we talk about, the rereadability of this book and of Pynchon's books and things like that. It's because of things like this. Like, you can understand that after you have a discussion with somebody, or you read someone's thoughts on it online somewhere. And then now that knowledge lives in there. So the next time you read it, you can remember that, and it starts to help put all those pieces together. So I love things like that. I love the attention to detail and the amount of effort that goes into telling a story like this.
Yeah, agreed. It's incredible. I guess he did like 7 or 8 drafts of this book.
I believe it, yeah.
And it you can tell because everything just fits together so coherently, that there's really, not only is there not like one bad grammatical sentence in the book, it all works perfectly, but it also just the ways in which things knit together. I mean, there is a reference in the Ken Erdetti section at the very beginning of the book to there being a little hook on the side of his video phone. And of course, like, you have no reason to know what that is at that point in the book, but once you've gotten through the video calling section, you know that is a remnant of the mask period of video calling, where everyone hung their masks from the side of their thing on these little hooks that were supplied. So just in terms of how everything from the smallest detail there up to the biggest, philosophical things all knits together perfectly. It feels like what he is doing is projecting a world. To borrow that Pynchonian phrase that we talked about with Sarah Marcus from Crying of Lot 49. This really does feel like he is projecting something fully formed that you can like really live within and feel down in sort of your nerve endings. So that brings us to the longest chapter in the book. I think I said like 50 to 70 pages. I think it's about 50 is what it is. But it is the longest chapter in the book. It is this description of what being in AA is like. Boston AA is the kind of specific milieu of this book. What were your thoughts on this section of the book? What are your thoughts, I guess, on maybe on AA in particular?
So I have no personal experience with AA. I don't even really have anybody that I know personally who has gone through it. My wife's grandfather was an alcoholic, but he did not, to my knowledge, go through AA. He just managed to quit and maintain sobriety. As far as like what I feel about it, I have mixed thoughts. I understand its utility and its purpose, and I think that there's definitely a place in the world for it. I think it gets there. I'm trying to think of how to phrase this without really putting my foot in my mouth, but I think the combination of it and using religion as a means of achieving sobriety is a dangerous thing, because ultimately you're replacing one addiction with another in that situation. One's just tangible and the other's not. But that would be, I can't really level that complaint at it because it's not necessarily the case all of the time. I think it is certainly something that does happen from time to time, and I do think that AA has its faults. But I am also sure that there are plenty of people who have benefited tremendously from it and who have been able to absolutely regroup their lives and take control of their situation again as a result of using AA or NA and its programs and offerings that it has for it. So a little bit of good, a little bit of bad, but I think it's definitely something. It is a good thing to have available for a lot of people.
Sure. Yeah, especially given that it's free.
Mm-hmm.
And then how do you feel about this section of the book?
Oh, as far as the section of the book, it's insanely beautiful. It's depressing as hell. It's it was a when I say it was an exhausting read, I don't mean that in a bad way. I read this section and I typically try to read anywhere from like 20 to 30, 40 pages at a time, just to kind of not outpace myself in taking notes and doing what I need to do for the episodes. But I got through this one knowing it was a longer chapter, but at the end of it, I was like, I have to just kind of take a break for like a couple of days at this point.
Yeah.
It's almost like getting book hangover from a
Just for a
40-page
chapter.
section. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really like it is so powerful and so well done. And it brings up a lot of really, really important and very, very good points. And it's clear that he really understood what he was talking about when he wrote this section. And I'm sure it's something that was hard for him to write. I'm sure that it was something that was cathartic for him to write. And it shows on the page. It is absolutely phenomenal writing. Top tier. Just it is incredible, and it almost is a standalone piece of art. Like you could really just remove this chapter from the book and just have it and just teach a class on it. It is that well done.
It's very similar to the IRS recruitment chapter of the Pale King in that episode.
Yes.
Yeah. Which they did. They did do that. It's called Something to Do About Paying Attention. I'd highly recommend everyone go buy it and read it if you don't plan on reading the rest of the Pale King, or if you already have the Pale King. It's just a great thing to revisit. Yeah, I would say that's true about the Boston AA section as well. What I can say is I did not go to AA, but I went to NA. In just a couple of weeks, I'll be 7 years sober from the substance that I used.
Nice.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very, very excited about that. And it is about as accurate of a depiction of what being in this kind of program is like, and the people that you run into in these types of programs is like that I have ever come across. It is very clearly informed by a lot of very serious sort of like study, participation, and just sort of listening to how these kind of systems go. Because this segment is actually, and I think what turns it into something approaching like just a standalone piece of art that you're talking about, is this section almost exists more as a breakdown of what addiction is in the first place. Because like, yes, it does deal extensively with how AA meetings go, between, you know, the types of speakers you get, what they talk about, what people's reactions to people speaking is, and even down to the shitty urns of coffee and breaking down tables afterward. Like it's very detailed in all of that. But there is also a lot of work being done here to describe how an addiction builds, how it takes advantage of you, and then eventually, you know, what can land you in AA in the first place, or NA in the first place. And all of that is very true. You know, my addiction was never bad enough that I was in danger of sort of losing my living situation, or going completely bankrupt or anything like that. Thank God. But I did have money problems, and it did seriously impact my cognition, my ability to live like a very fulfilled life during that period of my life, and led me to make a lot of really bad mistakes. And the only reason I ended up like quitting was honestly because I needed to go to Europe for a trip that I was taking to Germany to do some like work for the German government, as strange as that sounds. And I knew that I wasn't going to be able to have access to it. So like what pushed me to quit in the first place wasn't even necessarily an intense desire at the time to like, I need to quit right now. It was, I knew that I needed to quit eventually, and this was going to be the best that I possibly could to, as far as a time frame to do it in, or I wasn't going to have this opportunity to go do something that I was relatively excited about. So I feel very lucky that the degree of my addiction did not reach most of what is relayed in this chapter, but it is incredibly accurate of kind of the way in which these things build and the way in which these things kind of take over your life, and then the way, particularly the way in which these things become less about fun and become more about management, as he describes. And then it is, yeah, it's I haven't read anything like it. There's a lot of stuff that's been written about drugs that you can read. There is not much in my experience that has been written about the process of recovery or an analysis of addiction in a fictional context, a novel that I feel like works this well. Maybe the stuff exists and I just haven't read it, but it really brings me back to those days of my life, in a way that I do have a fondness for. Not for the usage of it, but for the kind of community aspect of it. And since I have moved away from where I attended NA meetings, I don't really have much of a connection to that anymore. I have luckily gotten through that addictive period where I would not go back and use that substance again. And so I haven't felt the need to like search out a new meeting to attend in the city that I live in. And so it kind of helps remind me of that period of my life, because while things were crazy, there is like a real warmth and community to it that Wallace very, very perfectly captures. And that feeling of like not understanding how or why it works is very, very accurate. I don't know why it worked. I remember there was a guy who came and talked to me once who literally screamed at me, "Why don't I want to use meth anymore?" Because he didn't understand why either. And this was a guy whose life had been like completely destroyed by this one thing, to a degree of a lot of the characters that are in this book, and just losing that craving or losing that aspect of what had been such a huge part of his life for so long was just confusing to him. And I think you're right to a certain degree that the foundations of AA are certainly religious. There is that religiosity to it. At no point in my time in the program would I say that there was a heavy influence of religion on it. There is that idea of like believing in something larger than yourself that you maybe refer to as God or the creator or whatever, but that can be anything. One of the women I knew, her higher power was the dumpster that was at her apartment complex.
Hey, whatever works, man.
So, you can kind of pick whatever you want. And I apologize in advance to my spouse if I mischaracterize the story or mess up the retelling of the story, but she took a class or several classes on like drugs and addiction and dependency when she was in college. And in one of them, if I am remembering correctly, she will correct me if I am wrong once she listens to this. And I can do an on-air correction. They did a couple of classes on like NA or AA in these recovery programs where they invited some speakers to come in, one whom it worked really, really well for, one whom it didn't work at all for, and then someone who was kind of in the middle on it. And essentially the takeaway by the time they listened to all three of these people's stories and retelling it was just, it's complicated. Like this is something that does work for some people. It is also something that for some people will never work, and they're not going to be able to recover from their addiction through this means. And then for some people, they're able to kind of flit in and out of it and use it as like a measure to curb cravings of addiction. But they don't need to be as dedicated to it as like the end house residents are. And yeah, I think that the best kind of takeaway to have towards something like AA or NA is just that it's complicated. That this is not an easy thing to break down and understand. This is not an easy thing to kind of psychologize, which Gately admits. I really love this quote on page 349, where it says, when Gately finally snapped to the fact one day, about 4 months into his Ennet House residency, that quite a few days seemed to have gone by without his playing with the usual idea of slipping over to Unit Number 7 and getting loaded in some non-uremic way the courts couldn't prove. That several days had gone without even his thinking of oral narcotics or a tightly rolled Dubois or a cold foamer on a hot day. When he realized that the various substances he didn't used to be able to go a day without absorbing hadn't even, occurred to him in almost a week. Gately hadn't felt so much grateful or joyful as just plain shocked. The idea that AA might actually somehow work unnerved him. He suspected some sort of trap, some new sort of trap. At this stage, he and the other Ennet residents who were still there and starting to snap to the fact that AA might work began to sit around late together one night, going batshit because it seemed to be impossible to figure out just how AA worked. It did, yes, tentatively seem maybe actually to be working. But Gately couldn't for the life of him figure out how just sitting on hemorrhoid-hostile folding chairs every night, looking at nose pores and listening to cliches could work. Nobody's ever been able to figure AA out, is another binding commonality. That's true. That's just absolutely true. And I think that is, at least for me, some of the most intriguing aspects of it as a program, is that you could probably write a thesis about how it works, about how something about communal struggle, communal identification, and sort of adherence to a program can cause you to sort of reset those circuits in your brain. I'm sure someone can and has done that. But I think that also, to a certain degree, strips out some of what makes it work for people. That if you try to over-explain it, and if you try to overemphasize just the functionality of it, that it is going to end up taking away your ability to find it sort of expedient for you. And this is where I think the conversation between Gately and is it Jeffrey Day in the earlier section who's screaming about the cliches and who has a mild tiff with Randy?
Think so.
Or Dwayne Glynn, one of those two. I think that what's so important that works as reincorporation in this segment with that earlier one, where he's just screaming and yelling about these cliches and how is he supposed to put any kind of faith in these cliches, and how is this ever going to work? This doesn't make any sense to him. He's trying to overly psychologize it because he needs to do that in order to put faith in it, and Gately is just sort of silent through all of that. And then there's I think it's a footnote, but it might just be a portion of his sort of interior monologue in the scene where he talks about how there is something he could tell this resident, but he's not in a place to receive that information. And so he has to wait until that resident is in a place to receive it. And he has to hope that he's going to be able to white knuckle it until he gets to that point and kind of Gately can talk to him about it. That in and of itself is a very real dynamic, especially when you start to put in more sober time than a lot of people who enter these programs at a very low level of sober time or no sober time, to borrow David Foster Wallace's phrase. But also I think it is really clever here because it is clear that Gately goes through a similar thing, that he recounts not just this portion where he sits around with some of the other people and is confused about how the program works, but then later in the same chapter, he makes mention of a meeting where he stands up and he just screams basically for the entirety of the meeting about how just fake it is and how much he hates it. And it is clear that he at one time had a similar degree of kind of cynicism or anger towards the program that he had to work through. And so he's looking at this sort of younger individual in terms of a level of sobriety and realizing that they are going through a very similar thing that he is. And that is not made evidently clear on the page. This is a case of very subtle reincorporation that I think you really do only pick up on later reads, because your first read is so focused on like putting all of these different pieces together. But it is just a really, really excellent breakdown of how these programs work, and oftentimes what is going to lead to success or failure in them. And often it is to kind of take it back to the things we've been talking about in this episode in particular, often it has to do with how you're going to give yourself over to it, the level you're going to give yourself over to it, and what that looks like. This is certainly one of those programs that if you are willing to surrender yourself to it, it can be very expedient for you.
So it's interesting that you point that out, especially after what we had talked about earlier in this episode with Morath's sort of deconstruction of how America works. I think I mean, this is something I'm just seeing right now in the sections that I've highlighted within this chapter. But that idea that, and you're absolutely right, to kind of back it up a second here.
I talked about a lot of random things.
I mean, that's what we do on the show, is it not? To the idea of why AA or NA works, I think, to your point, that it can't really be nailed down to a singular thing or even a few things. I think that's because to do so would be reductive, because it's really up to the willingness of the person who is in the program. And more often than not, I think that the people who are there want to be there. It's kind of like as a parent, like, if you have to ask, like, am I doing the right thing for my kids, or was this right or wrong? Like, the more you're having to question yourself, the better you're doing at parenting, because you actually give a shit. I think it's kind of the same with AA. Like, if you're putting yourself in there, you're probably going to have a better chance of success in and of the fact that you actually want to be there, or, you have some drive to get yourself clean. And on 357, it says, the bitch of the thing is that you have to want to. If you don't want to do as you're told, I mean, as it's suggested to you, it means that your own personal will is still in control. And Eugenio Martinez over at Innit House never tires of pointing out that your personal will is the web of your disease, sits and spins in still. The will you call your own ceased to be yours as of who knows how many substance-drenched years ago. It's now shot through with the spidered fibrosis of your disease. His own experience's term for the disease is the spider. You have to starve the spider. You have to surrender your will. This is why most people come in and hang out and hang in only after their own entangled will has just about killed them. You have to want to surrender your will to people who know how to starve the spider. You have to know how to take this. You have to want to take the suggestions, want to abide by the traditions of anonymity, humility, surrender to the group conscience. If you don't obey, nobody will kick you out. They won't have to. You'll end up kicking yourself out if you steer by your own sick will. This is maybe why just about everybody in the White Flag group tries so hard to be so disgustingly humble, kind, helpful, tactful, cheerful, non-judgmental, tidy, energetic, sanguine, modest, generous, fair, orderly, patient, tolerant, attentive, truthful. It isn't like the group makes them do it. It's more like that the only people who end up able to hang for serious time in AA are the ones who willingly try to be these things. This is why, to the cynical newcomer or fresh Innit House resident, serious AAs look like the weird combinations of Gandhi and Mr. Rogers with tattoos and enlarged livers and no teeth, who used to beat wives and diddle daughters and now rhapsodize about their bowel movements. It's all optional. Do it or die. So, in rereading that and thinking about what we were talking about earlier with Morath, and like this idea that there's that freedom to the freedom from and the freedom to. And I think with AA, you have to give up that there's a certain part of your freedom you have to give up, because you have to understand that you can't do this on your own. You have to let someone else step in and take control and tell you what to do. And in all honesty, a lot of people who are suffering through addiction need that. They need that rigidity. They need that support system. They need that structure in their life. Otherwise, they cannot get sober. And it's interesting because I'm thinking now about the addiction that, the book is talking about, typically chemical addiction, right? Drugs and alcohol and things like that. But if you translate that over to a social media addiction and where we are in our current world and this sort of drive to fascism that we're on, that's there's a parallel to that. We've gotten ourselves into this point where people are addicted to social media, and the only way to get to kind of like separate yourself from it is to give up a certain amount of your freedom. But in this case, we're giving up that freedom and not getting the help to get away from it. It's just giving up the freedom and still moving in the same direction. So I don't know. There's a weird kind of connection that my brain's trying to make in all of this, and it's just kind of happening in real time.
No, I think you're absolutely right, and I think that it is no, it is no coincidence that a lot of this stuff is right next to each other in the book. Like, yes, the book is jumbled up in its timeline, but a lot of this stuff is very thematically linked, and I think that is exactly, not to just completely reiterate what you just said, but I think you're exactly correct in that it is an example of how sometimes giving yourselves up to this system or giving yourself over to a rigid sort of ordering of your life is a good thing if you are in a predominantly negative situation.
Yes.
And I think that kind of loops back in with the earlier stuff involving Schtitt, where like, is he a fascist? Yeah, it would appear as though he is one, but if you do give yourself over to this rigid system of athletic achievement, there is a chance that does work for you, and that does work for you in a way that is transformative.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, not to just sort of make a simple point, but it's complicated, and a lot of it depends on where you're at in your own personal life, And I'm sure there are certain people who have tried entering NA or AA and referred to it as fascist and gave up. I'm sure that is a comparison that is made, but I think you're exactly correct that it is something that if you are in a position of need, you just need to have somebody tell you what to do, and that's going to get you in a better position in life. Then if you're in this particular dire of a setup, then that may be what you have to say yes to. There is a lot of other detail that we could go over in this section. I think it is best to be experienced, from a reading perspective. Another important detail of this is that we learn that Joelle Van Dyne did not die. That rather than succeeding in her purposeful overdose, she was rescued and then was basically immediately sent to Ennet House. So that places her amongst this other cast of characters. And we get nice little check-ins on all of the different residents that we've come to learn about. Tiny Ewell, Jeffrey Day, Kate Gompert, Ken Erdedy. They all sort of get mentioned along with Don Gately and Joelle Van Dyne, including Randy Lenz. But fuck that guy. And it's something that I do think you just have to experience. I can talk and psychologize it all I want. That is not ultimately, I think, going to capture what it is like to read this section.
Yeah.
And I think the best thing that I can do is just let people know that like what is being articulated here is very true. It is very accurate to real life. It is one of the ways in which reading other people's experiences through a fictional lens can really help you build empathy. I guess the last thing I do want to say from a perspective of how geniusly written this is. Oh, there is also the great little aside that we learn about how the Statue of Liberty holds the product for the subsidized time every single year.
I was telling my wife about that while I was reading it. She's like, Jesus Christ, that's fucked.
And then, of course, in the puppet show, we learn that the Whopper fell off when they were trying to hoist it, and it killed some people. Is towards the end, David Foster Wallace gives us two different stories of two different women who suffer from addiction as an analysis of either looking at cause or effect. This segment should not work. From a perspective of like the reaction it causes in the reader. And what he's talking about is this idea that in AA, the last thing you want to do is prescribe a reason for your addiction. This idea that like, I am an addict because this happened to me when I was a kid, or I am an addict because XYZ occurred. versus the second woman who simply describes the circumstances that she has had to deal with as a result of her addiction. And that one can be viewed as blame, and the other can be viewed as simply depiction. Both circumstances that are described are nightmarish and awful.
Yep.
And both the reader and the characters have empathy for both of them. But by the end of this segment, I feel Wallace is successful in imparting to the reader how these two characters are different, and how trying to prescribe a cause for your addiction, like the first woman does, can actually lead to a harder time being able to wrestle it. Because at the end of the day, the cause does not matter. Like, the reason why you're an addict does not matter. It matters in a therapeutic sense, that if you're going to therapy, it is good to be able to recognize patterns in yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But it does not matter to the recovery of the chemical need or the physical need that you have. You know, understanding where that impulse comes from doesn't help curb the impulse when it is a disease like addiction.
Yeah.
And so the way in which he is able to depict these two stories, where he is lightly condemning one of these two women, but not in a way that actually condemns the experience or the emotions that she's feeling. I don't know how you do that, like, as a writer, because when you go through and you read it, you kind of, especially if you don't have much experience with this kind of thing, I don't know if this is the experience you had. Maybe I'm broadcasting something that people don't have. You kind of shy away from the AA members in their kind of recoiling at the first woman's story. Mm-hmm. Like, how dare you sort of judge this person for prescribing the reason or the cause for their addiction. But then as soon as you get through that other story and you see the ways in which these two people kind of take account differently, at least for me anyway, I totally now understand why there is a difference there, and how the difference between trying to prescribe a cause versus the effect leads to differential outcomes in recovery. And maybe that just comes to the fact that I have a background associated with this, but I think it's a really remarkable kind of thing that Wallace does, especially given that he provides so much more time to the first woman's story as opposed to the second woman's in terms of just the amount of pages that it takes up.
Yeah.
Do you have any other quotes or thoughts that you want to read from?
No, because I think you're absolutely right. It needs to be experienced, and I think even for people listening who have read the book before, I don't think there's anything that we could say. I think that kind of, okay, so I'll say this. The really unique thing about the way this chapter works, specifically the Boston AA segment, is that much like AA itself or NA, the experience of it is totally unique. I think each person who reads this section of the book is going to come away with something that is dependent on their own personal situation. I don't think Wallace is trying to pull any tricks here and make some kind of, there's no hidden meaning or anything like that. I think it's just a matter of you get from this what it means to you personally. And so everyone will have a sort of surface level understanding of it and experience with it the same. But then I think certain parts of it are going to resonate more than others with certain people, and vice versa. And so I think that even just by reading quotes from it, yeah, we can highlight how great the prose is and all that. But, the section that we read might not be the section that really resonates with one person or one group of listeners. And, they may have a different take on it than we do. So I think it's one of those sections that's just so highly personal that it would not necessarily be a disservice to sit and pick out favorite parts of it, but it would just kind of not really, there's really no necessity to it.
Yeah, no, I couldn't have said that better myself. All right, so that leads us to the ending section here. And this is an interesting section in how it's laid out. Because there's the sort of retelling or depiction of the movie that they're watching, but then there's also a lot of stuff about Mario and his dad, and there's also stuff about Lyle.
Yeah.
There's there's a lot that is sort of going on through here, which I guess maybe it's best to just take this strand by strand. So every year on Interdependence Day, which we now know as the holiday in which the U.S. was reconfigured into ONAN, which is the Organization of North American Nations, the members of ETA watch Mario's, as it puts here, first halfway coherent film cartridge. A 48-minute job shot 3 summers back in the carefully decorated janitor closet of Subdorm B with his head mount Bolex H64 and foot treadle. If it's odd that Mario's first finished entertainment consists of a film of a puppet show, like a kid's puppet show, then it probably seems even odder that the film's proven to be way more popular with ETA's adults and adolescents than it is with the woefully historically underinformed children it had first been made for. Essentially, the film, as we mentioned at the top of the episode, is a depiction of like a political cabinet meeting between members of the U.S. government and the different Onanite nations as they discuss the issue with Canada, I guess is the way that I'll put it.
Yeah.
And effectively, it depicts this idea that a man named Johnny Gentle, famous crooner, rose to power in the U.S. and, as part of his administration, wanted to unite Canada and the U.S. together into like one sort of nation state. And then eventually Mexico joined as well. And his big initiative in office was to clean up America. And part of that was an energy initiative in which annular fusion was created, as we know from earlier in the book, by himself, Dr. James O. Incandenza. And that generated a insane amount of toxic waste, because they hadn't quite nailed the process down yet, as the book puts, of using the waste from the first step in the second step. And so what they chose to do was dump all of the toxic waste in one concentrated area of the US. But then they figured out that that actually sort of cuts against Johnny Gentle's goal of beautifying and cleaning up the country. So they just decided to give it to Canada by force. And this is where the concavity convexity comes into play. You hear people arguing about it at the party that Joelle plans to kill herself at, where one country views it as a concavity and the other country views it as a convexity, and it's this big political disagreement over all of this toxic waste that has completely irradiated the landscape. We've had references to giant, like, deformed toddlers. There is also, I don't think it's happened yet, but later there's like a story about absolutely massive feral guinea pigs that have been irradiated by the toxic waste. And so this toxic waste and this territorial dispute, most of which lies in what is now French Canada, is the big sort of political hullabaloo. And we've already talked a lot about how prescient this book feels.
Holy shit.
But Johnny Gentle is a real sort of Trumpian character. It is really hard not to make that comparison, especially nowadays.
I rewatched Idiocracy again the other day with my wife and my kids, and I was like, yeah, and kind of like, you know, we're moving way and way closer to this, but at the same time, like, Infinite Jest kind of also got on the same thing with Johnny Gentle.
Yeah.
So he's just basically, Johnny Gentle became Herbert Camacho, and Herbert Camacho is who we have as president now, apparently. So
this is one of the funniest sections of the book so far.
Oh, absolutely.
It is, from all of the fake headlines to just the description of Johnny Gentle as a person who just, like, is constantly taking in pure oxygen but still tries to talk in meetings, so it's all of his dialogue is just and he wears masks all the time. The US Department of Unspecified Services is staffed mostly by people who are described as looking essentially like sort of caricatures of Mormons, where they've all got close cropped hair and they walk around with like shiny teeth and nice bright white uniforms and gloves.
Yeah.
And he's just got this sort of cleaning up America initiative. I'm trying to find the lines where it's just describing different aspects of here it is on 382. This motionless face on the ETA screen is Johnny Gentle, third party stunner. Johnny Gentle, the first US president ever to swing his microphone around by the cord during his inauguration speech, whose new white-suited Office of Unspecified Services retinue required inauguration attendees to scrub and mask and then walk through chlorinated foot baths at public pools. Johnny Gentle, managing somehow to look presidential in a Fukuyama microfiltration mask, whose inaugural address heralded the advent of a tighter, tidier nation, who promised to clean up government and trim fat and sweep out waste and hose down our chemically troubled streets and to sleep darn little until he'd fashioned a way to rid the American psychosphere of the unpleasant debris of a throwaway past, to restore the majestic ambers and purple fruits of a culture he now promises to rid the toxic effluvia choking our highways and littering our byways and grunging up our sunsets and cruddying those harbors in which televised garbage barges lay stacked up at anchor, clotted and impotent amid undulating clouds of pot-bellied gulls and those disgusting blue-bodied flies that live on shit. First U.S. president ever to say shit publicly, shuddering. Rusty-hulled barges, cruising up and down petroleated coastlines, are laying up reekly and stacked and emitting CO as they await the opening of new landfills and toxic repositories the people demanded in every area but their own. The Johnny Gentle whose CUSP had been totally upfront about seeing American renewal as an essentially aesthetic affair. The Johnny Gentle who promised to be possibly sometimes unpopular architect of a more or less spotless America that cleaned up its own side of the street, of a new era nation that'd look out for Uno, of a one-time world policeman that was now going to retire and have its blue uniform deep dry cleaned and placed in storage in triple thick plastic dry cleaning bags and hang up its cuffs to spend some quality domestic time raking its lawn and cleaning behind its refrigerator and dandling its freshly bathed kids on its neatly pressed multi-tufted pants knee. A Gentle behind whom a diorama of the Lincoln Memorial's Lincoln smiled down benignly. A Johnny Gentle who was, as of this new minute, sending forth the call that he wasn't in this for a popularity contest. Popsicle stick and felt puppets in the address's audience, assuming puzzled-looking expressions above their tiny green surgical masks. A President JGFC who said he wasn't going to stand here and ask us to make some tough choices because he was standing here promising he was going to make them for us, who asked us simply to sit back and enjoy the show, who handled wild applause from camouflage fatigue and sandal and poncho-clad CUSPs with the unabashed grace of a real pro, who had black hair and silver sideburns, just like his big-headed puppet, and the dusty brick-colored tan seen only among those without homes, and those whose homes had a dermolatex hytrospectral personal sterilization booth, who declared that neither tax and spend nor cut and borrow compromised the ticket into a whole new millennial era. Here, more puzzlement among the inaugural audience, which Mario represents by having the tiny finger puppets turn rigidly toward each other, and then away, and then toward, who alluded to ripe and available novel sources of revenue just waiting out there, unexploited, not seen by his predecessors because of the trees. And then he includes a question mark in the text after that. Who foresaw budgetary adipose trimmed with a really big knife. The Johnny Gentle who stressed above all, simultaneously pleaded for and promised an end to atomized Americans' fractious blaming of one another for our terrible internal troubles. Here bobs and smiles from both wealthily green mask puppets and homeless puppets in rags and mismatched shoes and with used surgical masks, all made by ETA's 4th and 5th grade crafts class under the supervision of Mrs. Heath, of matchsticks and popsicle stick shards and pool table felt with sequins for eyes and painted fingernail pairings for smiles and frowns under the masks. The Johnny Gentle chief executive who pounds a rubber glove fist on the podium so hard it knocks the seal askew and declares that, damn it, there just must be some people besides each other of us to blame, to unite in opposition to. And he promises to eat light and sleep very little until he finds them in the Ukraine or the Teutons or the Wacko Latins, or, pausing with that one right arm up and head down in the climactic Vegas way, closer to right below our nose. He swears he'll find some cohesion renewing other and then make some tough choices. Alludes to a whole new North America for a crazy post-millennial world. First U.S. president ever to use boss as an adjective. Is throwing his surgical gloves into the miniature inaugural crowd as souvenirs is Mario's own touch. Oh
my God. He is every... And so here's the other one. I was watching Hitchhiker's Guide yesterday while I was getting my new tattoo. He's Zaphod Beeblebrox also.
Yes.
That just absolute clown with so much charisma that everyone's just like, yeah, all right, cool.
Yeah. And I ended up reading out a longer quote than I expected because I think that it is important given how much we've talked about the fascistic angle of these couple of chapters, where like he's doing all of this work, but it is all fascist rhetoric. He is talking about making the tough decisions for people, of just, you don't have to work hard, you just have to let me work hard, you just have to put faith in me, you just have to vote for me. And then it slowly unfurls over that quote that I read out from just kind of like a little bit of a strange, he's swinging a microphone cord at his inauguration all the way up to, I am going to find an other for us to prosecute, as the very end of that quote, which is about the most fascist thing that you can possibly do.
It's not us. It can't be us. It's someone else somewhere else is making us bad.
Yeah, exactly. And it is as a, like, I swear I didn't think about how I broke up this book into chunks in terms of what is covered in them. I just sort of did it by 100-page increments. But it has worked out incredibly well in terms of the material that Wallace is doing in each of these chunks, where this really does feel like a culmination of, over these pages, Wallace has kind of shown the reader a couple of different ways to live, or a couple of different ways to order themselves that have maybe some fascistic tendencies. And he's criticized, or at least analyzed, the very systems by which we try to live an exacting life through the eschaton scene. And it all leads to this, just an absolute buffoon who gets in charge of a country and then destroys the entire cohesion of a continent as a result of that. Do you have any thoughts on the Johnny Gentle stuff, or any quotes that you want to read out?
No, I think that you read the entire quote that I like highlighted, and I highlighted pretty much all of that section too, because
so
it's
did
just so goddamn funny.
Yeah.
And the stops every now and then to talk about how Mario's framing all of this with finger puppets and shit. Oh my God, it's so good.
It's amazing. Yeah. So then I guess maybe the best way to go from there is to the Lyle stuff. Where this is where he's being reintegrated for the first time. After the chapter where he's first described. And it turns out that actually he's quite a sage. That instead of being this kind of weird guy who licks you for your sweat, students will go sit in the sauna in off hours to build up a sweat just to have him talk to them.
So he is the weird guy who will lick your sweat.
He is that, yes, but there's
a good reason.
You want him to lick your sweat.
It's worthwhile.
And the main way in which this is sort of analyzed is through this sort of interaction he has with Lamont Chu, which really feels like an important one for this section of pages, especially because what he eventually tells Lamont Chu is this absolutely devastating quote of, "You burn with hunger for food that does not exist." And then he, of course, ends the section by saying, "You might consider how escape from a cage must surely require, foremost, awareness of the fact of the cage. And I believe I see a drop on your temple right there." That's essentially an AA slogan. That's just what is the most sort of widely understood slogan in AA, that admitting you have a problem is the first step to fixing it. And in this case, it's being able to see the cage is the first step to being able to walk out of it. And there's a lot of cage imagery in the Boston AA section as it relates to addiction. And so again, like, Wallace is tying all of this stuff together all of the time. You just have to be really looking for it. And it is one of these cases where Lamont Chu is like really in his head about seeing this kind of professional future before him. And if being aware of that is going to either make it not happen, or he feels a degree of extreme self-consciousness over wanting to be famous, of wanting to have his photo taken. And that is kind of the context of what they're talking about, but it is there. The subtext is much deeper, especially in terms of these chapters in particular.
Yeah, I couldn't help but think of Pynchon in reading this section with Lamont Chu, specifically just because this whole the section towards the end of it where like you said, Lyle's talking about he wants the hunger for food that does not exist, and then he goes on to talk about how to be envied, admired is not a feeling, nor is fame a feeling. There are feelings associated with fame, but few of them are any more enjoyable than the feelings associated with envy of fame. This idea that, like, so many people think that they want to be famous and have this sort of drive to be famous, but never really fully comprehend what it means to have that and how disruptive that can be towards a person's life. And so for him to kind of like discuss this and talk about how, like, maybe that's not all it's cracked up to be, and maybe having your photo plastered everywhere isn't the thing you really want it to be, and maybe there is some benefit in anonymity and living your life privately and doing what you want to do, and you can still share your art with the world, but it doesn't have to be with your your photo plastered on the back cover, or with your name being splashed everywhere. Like, you don't have to have that. That's not a thing that's really going to do you any good at the end of the day. And it's really remarkable to see someone, and again, this is why I was kind of thinking about Pynchon, like, for someone like him who has so much influence in the world creatively that he does, but to retain the level of anonymity that he has is insane. And it's because that's what he chose. Like, he chose that from day one. And that sort of self-awareness and self-control is incredibly admirable. Because if you think about even just little things where you kind of, like, the little parts of your day where you might sort of brag about something that you did because you're proud of it. And there's not that there's anything wrong with it, but it is still self-serving. But to have the restraint to not do that, especially when you're putting out work that is so popular and that is so fundamentally important in the world of literature or whatever medium you work in, it is insane, especially in this day and age, to maintain that anonymity.
Yeah, couldn't have said it better myself.
That being said, I don't want anyone to lick my sweat to tell me that. I get it now. Like, it's on the page. We're good.
All right. So that brings us to kind of our last thread here, which is some of the details about Mario and his father. And this is just, it's so nice. It's so, the fact that they had this thing together with filmmaking.
Yeah.
And they were able to kind of have a degree of mutual enjoyment about it, is just, it is one of those rare spots of just, like, really nice humanity more than anything else.
Yeah.
I don't think I have really much else to say about it other than that. That and it's pretty funny. The whole thing about the found drama and driving people crazy by playing a video of themselves at them in a theater.
I loved that.
Yeah.
And explicitly telling them, like, don't pay money to watch this. And people, of course, their natural tendency is to, here's all my money.
Yeah.
But no, you're absolutely right. It is the relationship that we see here between the two of them is incredibly tender, and it drives that, like you said, that humanity that exists in these characters, and that's something that I think tends to get overlooked, especially when people talk about books in general, right, and how much they like the characters. So often, I think that we tend to forget, especially with large books like this, like it's easy to write a long book, right? You can spend hours and pages talking about the world and talking about the plot and all that. But to be able to craft these characters that feel so real that you can have these scenes with them that are just a couple of pages sometimes, but you can really feel the humanity and the soul that exists within them as characters, and you're drawn to them and you feel and you empathize with them. That is an incredible talent to have. And it's so heartening to see this kind of relationship, especially between a character that up to this point, like, we don't really like, himself is never really portrayed as a great guy. Um, but he clearly loves Mario, and like in a true, like, fatherly way. Like, he really cares about this kid. And he really wants to encourage his passion, and Mario's reciprocating all of that. Like, he loves making films, and he loves working with his dad. And it's just the joy that exists between them in this little moment is so wonderful.
Yeah. And there's, because this, we're not trying to do an exhaustive thing with this show, but there's a lot of moments of exemplifying positive communication through these chapters, which we have mentioned is like a major failing of most of the Incandenza family. And this is really one of those cases where, like, the way that they are in communication over filmmaking and over the way that they're kind of putting their efforts forward on that is one of those examples of, like, really, really positive communication. The whole AA segment is an example of really positive communication.
Yeah.
But very consistently, Mario is the sort of one who's capable of that. Him and Shact.
Yep.
Well, that was a marathon. A marathon of a lot of details. Do you have anything else you want to bring up or talk about before we answer some correspondence?
I did really love the back and forth, sort of passive aggressive news headlines that take place towards the end of this section, and the just batshit craziness of some of them. My baby has 6 eyes and basically no skull. Yeah, and it's funny, but at the same time, it is like it is also doing that world building again, right? There's a one about the softballers that found the poisonous waste, and it's just genius. It really just don't have other words for it right now. It's so good.
All right, so I guess maybe we just want to go back and forth on because we've had a tremendous response to this series.
We really have, and
which is really great. Yeah. Do you want to start with the first one from Xander?
Yeah, I'll take the first one. So we got this one from Xander. He says, "Hello. First off, thank you for your very in-depth answer to my previous email, specifically concerning my question about Mario. I completely agree with all you said about him being a sort of product of his addicted lineage, maybe even an antithesis, and would probably now say that his view is the one I would most readily agree with in the context of the novel, thanks to your discussion of it. I forgot to mention that I've only read Infinite Jest once and have just been combing through it along with the podcast to deepen my insight. I am positively a fan of 100 Years of Solitude, and your comparison to the pigtail incident with that of Mario was something that I would certainly never have thought of, yet was immensely interesting to mull over. I feel the way Marquez presents time in the novel is very similar to that of Wallace, as they are both novels of cycles which consume their inhabitants, either in the past, present, or future, yet also provides hope to escape these self-confirming energetic whirlpools. As for the section you went over last time, I have a few questions, much less than last time. 1, when I read the book, I found the description of Joel's suicide attempt immensely affecting. It was definitely difficult to get through, yet I'm glad I did, as it allowed me to shift my view of suicide from something that is inherently, quote, wrong with an individual to a legitimate disease which is profoundly isolating. I don't really have any specific questions regarding Joel's character due due to some later revelations, but was just curious as to what your overall impression of her as a character are overall, and how she fits into the overall thematic intent of the novel, or one of them at least. 2, the description of the Innit House residence is probably one of my favorite passages of the book due just to the pure comedic relief it offers. My theory of its overall importance to the text is that it serves to humanize addiction as a concept by adding a degree of comedy so that it can be more adeptly understood. My question is how you interpret the character of Tiny Ewell in your analysis. I suppose his fixation with tattoos could be a symptom of withdrawal or ignoring reality, but I am just generally interested in if you all think his obsession is just comic relief or has a deeper meaning. Overall, I just wanted to laud you all for another great episode, and I'm excited for the next. Also, happy Pynchon's B-Day on May 8th. Xander, thanks again so much for writing, and glad that we provided an excellent answer. If we're good at anything on this show, it's talking for a long time about any one thing. So we're always happy to do it. I can't speak to the 100 Years of Solitude. For whatever reason, I have not read that book. It is on my bookshelf, and I will get to it. Haven't read that, so I'll leave that part to Kate. To answer your first, well, you're not question, but your first comment. I'm glad that you were able to have that shift. I do generally believe that a lot of people, especially in America, have this view of suicide or suicidal ideation as a sort of like, what's wrong with you? Get over it. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of thing. And it's not that. It absolutely can be a call for help, and that is what it is, and that shouldn't be minimized. But at the same time, as someone who has struggled with these kind of things before, it is absolutely something that is beyond your own control. And to be able to see that represented in a book like this, as well as it is with Joelle, and also with Kate Gompert, it's really, for me at least, it's very encouraging just to see that there's someone else who has been through it, and who was able to articulate it better than myself. Because a lot of times the frustrating part of having those kind of thoughts and that kind of pain, or even that lack thereof, is the difficulty in communicating. Because especially if you're trying to explain it to a loved one or to a family member, and you can't really put it into words, it can lead to those misunderstandings that cause that problem of thinking of it as something as just, oh, they just want attention or whatever the case may be. So I'm glad that our discussion could help kind of shine a light on that for you. And I hope that was the case with other people who may have seen it that way as well. So I'm glad that you were able to kind of break through on that. Regarding your second part with your question about Tiny Ewell and his fixation with tattoos as a symptom of withdrawal or ignoring reality, it's an interesting thought. I don't know that I would say he has an addiction to it, but again, that you could, like we talked about earlier, you could have this. There's that whole idea of AA or NA acting as a sort of way of replacing one addiction with another. That's definitely not going to be the case with every single person who goes through there. But as someone who has several tattoos and only started getting them a few years ago, I wouldn't say it's so much of an addiction for me. I think for me, I always kind of wanted to have tattoos, and I was just always afraid of the reaction that it would get from family and the physical pain of it. In all honesty, both of which I just finally was like, I don't really care anymore. But for me, I think a lot of it is related to a sort of body dysmorphia thing where I've never really been comfortable in my own skin, and so having something that sits on top of it that I can look at and be happy with and be proud of is a sort of escape. And I guess you could maybe, in a way, there's an addiction element to that. I don't know. That's something my therapist would have to come and talk to me about. But I see where you're coming from with it, and it definitely could be like that. Could be his way of like, anytime I have an addictive tendency or I feel a need to consume the substance that was consuming me, I'm going to replace that temptation with getting a tattoo. Absolutely could be the case, and if that works for him, that works for him. But it's a good point to bring up.
Thank you again, Xander, for an email with so much sort of perspective and specificity. This is like probably the fourth time you've emailed us, and all of your questions have been really good.
I love it. I'm always looking forward to them.
Yeah, I'm glad that you appreciated my 100 Years of Solitude comparison with Mario. I think you're correct in that Mario does represent a bit of an antithesis to the generational cycles of trauma. I think that you're also probably onto something intertextually with how both of these books examine cycles and time. I think that Hundreds of Years of Solitude is really a case where um, there is no escape from that cycle, right? Like the way that that book ends. Sorry, the spoilers for like a 60-year-old book, but certainly the way that that ends is it ends up consuming everything, you know, um, and sort of resetting it back to zero for something new to come back in its place, in theory. Whereas Wallace with Infinite Jest is really more so showcasing the way to kind of escape from that cycle, almost in a way of breaking it, or in kind of escaping that Nietzschean idea of like a eternal return. I think that's where the two of them are exploring different ground in terms of the books themselves. But I think you are correct in that there is certainly some intertextuality between the two of them. Um, I really appreciate what you had to what you had to say about the book sort of shaping or reshaping your understanding of what suicide is. I can't really put it better than Cody did as far as why I think that's important. Um, as far as Tiny Ewell, I think that it's a couple of things. I think that the way in which his tattoo sort of analysis is written out is meant to provide some comedic relief. I do think that the deeper meaning is also there, in that it is a depiction of what happens to people when they go through withdrawal and recovery. You tend to get weirdly fixated on stuff. For me, it was watches. I don't know why, but when I was undergoing recovery and needed somewhere to like put that energy, I just got really into watches, like trying to figure out how they worked,
Interesting.
trying to figure out like what the differences were between them, and kind of obsessively looking at the different watches that like people either at meetings would have or just people I would see on the street. It gave me something to focus my attention on instead of thinking about sort of using or drugs in general. And I think that's what's really going on there. It doesn't happen to everybody, but it is true that you tend to need to put the energy that was previously put into your substance into something else, and I think that that's what Tiny Ewell is doing here. Um, I mean, if you want to take it like a level deeper, you could say that that both addiction and tattoos are something that often leave permanent marks on somebody, and so they are able to tell kind of a story of a person. And so that's probably why Tiny Ewell might be interested in specifically the meaning behind the tattoos. Um, but I think that more than anything else, it is meant to be a depiction of just something that does happen to people when something they dedicate so much of their time and energy to goes away, and they have to find another way to go about it. Our next email comes from Ben, who says, "Longtime listener, first time emailer. I've been really enjoying the DFW episodes lately. I appreciate the candor and level of detail both of you get into on these episodes and all the ones you do. They've been stirring up a lot of emotions and thoughts I had thought I had left buried somewhere, which I think is always a good thing. I went through a pretty obsessive DFW period from maybe my senior year of high school into a large portion of college. Looking back, it was definitely part of a whole lapsed Catholic thing that I probably don't have the space to get into. Suffice it to say, I was looking for an alternative value system, and I found one in Wallace's whole project. That's partly why I'm emailing today. One critique of Wallace that I think I've found looming large during my period of growing out of Wallace's work, as another correspondent put it, is something I might identify as a kind of lapsed Protestantism running underneath the surface of some of his work, Infinite Jest specifically. Putting it bluntly, one gets the sense that in the world of Wallace's work, you are either saved or damned. In other words, you're one of the preterite, doomed to circular spirals of self-consciousness and addiction, or one of the elect, possessed with some kind of secret moral wisdom that could be described as a series of cliches lived sincerely. This binary doesn't leave a lot of room for the gray area, where I would argue most of us live. It explains his treatment of Pemulus's character in the interview where he refers to Pemulus as the Antichrist or the devil. I can't remember which. It was the Antichrist. A characterization I thought was kind of unfair, given Pemulus's convincing speech to Hal about switching addictions. It also explains the character of Teddy Schacht, where I think Wallace realized he needed a normal character who isn't in either one of those two categories. This is a position that's put with no small amount of Gen X irony in David Foster Wallace's Portrait of an Infinitely Limited Mind by Ramon Glazov for The Exiled. A piece I found refreshing in my falling out period, but it's one that I've found now to be almost poisonously snide. It does rather convincingly, to me, however, trace Wallace's lineage to what he calls the Protestant addiction novel. Chief exemplar being Herbert Selby Jr., who wrote Requiem for a Dream that was brought up on a recent pod, and Last Exit to Brooklyn, which was a big influence on Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground, and which I really did not like. The Protestant addiction novels, according to Glazov, are a kind of "here but for the grace of God go I," tales where the reader is treated to tragedy porn and remains secure in one's convictions to never once sin lest one be damned. While I don't think this completely explains Infinite Jest, I do remember on the last time reading it thinking that Wallace's moral universe sometimes lends him to portraying the plight of the addicted, or the preterite, with a burlesque sense of tragedy. Often played for humor, I'm thinking specifically of the whole incest ecstasy of St. Teresa mask stuff, and even the reveal of Pemulus's family life. And a kind of "forgive them, they know not what they do" pose, which can only deliver from a very secure moral high ground up there on the cross. I wonder if you came across this critique at all, and if you had any thoughts about it. Again, I don't think it applies to all of Wallace's work, and sometimes I think The Pale King handles the problem and solution aspect of this a lot more effectively. Infinite Jest being a depiction of a problem, and The Pale King being a solution. Anyway, love the show. Sincerely, Ben. There's a lot there that I could respond to. I unfortunately have come to the conclusion that a lot of the David Foster Wallace criticism that exists is not great. It seems as though for a lot of people who operate in literary circles, there is an overarching obsession with his suicide that I think clutters their ability to properly respond to the meaning of his work. And I think that also does lead to a lot of misinterpretations of some of his work. I have not read the article you sent us a link to. I probably will, just out of sort of curiosity. But suffice it to say that like a lot of the professional criticism that I have read, I feel like is not particularly good or convincing in the argumentation that it tries to make. And I think that a lot of that comes from the fact that, at least to me anyway, I don't think David Foster Wallace was being particularly hidden in his themes or kind of agenda. He wrote a lot for someone who had a relatively short career, especially in nonfiction, that if read alongside Infinite Jest really kind of serves as a companion to a lot of his thought processes. And it doesn't really require a great amount of effort to, I think, understand his point. I think that your interpretation in regards to sort of Protestant addiction and this idea of the lapsed sort of belief in how that attaches itself to this idea of the preterite or the elect, I think you could read that. I do think, though, that there is, in your statement or in your email here, is sort of a conclusion jumping that you're reaching. I don't get the sense that he thinks that the people in Ennet House or the people who are stuck in those cycles are unsavable. I think this book is much more about the importance of working towards breaking a cycle, and less so about a permanent sort of damnation, which, to use that binary of preterite and elect, would mean that you are permanently damned or permanently saved. if you really take that out to its broadest conclusion. I don't think he's saying that. I think that instead what he is saying in a lot of things is that the difference between success or failure often depends upon someone's willingness to try and someone's willingness to examine different ways to live and someone's willingness to try and figure out what the right amount of control or sort of giving oneself up to another organization looks like for them. You know, a lot of the stuff that we've talked about in this episode in particular has to do with this idea of like fascism versus the freedom of choice or freedom to choose or freedom from choice. I think that a lot of that remains unresolved in some of the argumentation of the book because it depends on the person. Obviously, fascism is not the answer, and Wallace knows that. But for some people, you know, that is what they require. They require a kind of personal fascism to break them out of whatever cycle or habit they're in. That just doesn't work on a countrywide scale or on a system scale of that size. So I don't think I necessarily read the same thing into it that you are in terms of him saying that you are one or the other. I agree with you on your criticism of Last Exit to Brooklyn and Requiem for a Dream. I'm not particularly compelled by either of those. And I do think that there is a tradition of writing that you are certainly responding to that does exist. I don't think Wallace fits into that. And I think the best example I can think of is the fact that the commencement speech he gave towards the end of his life, like the last thing he technically kind of released, as much as that word is applicable to his commencement speech, is about this idea of choosing what to focus on, choosing what to think about, choosing what your responses are going to be. I think that for him, that is what he was trying to impart across a lot of his career, was this idea of like sincerity and honesty, yes, but that needs to come about as a result of a intense self-examination. And the characters in these books who sort of fail to examine themselves are the ones that don't make it there. You know, like Randy Lenz would be one of the preterite in your kind of binary state. Randy Lenz does not try to figure out how to break out of his cycle of addiction. He chooses to deal with the anxiety of his addiction by torturing animals. That is not actually addressing the problem. That is swallowing the symptoms of a problem through the creation of another problem. Don Gately is the exact opposite of Randy Lenz, and that like, and I'm getting real into like spoiler stuff. So if you haven't read this book, maybe skip over my answer to this email. But Don Gately is a case of someone who is trying and has succeeded to break out of that cycle and is set up for a pretty bad time towards the end of the book. Out of nothing but someone else's actions. Everything he can possibly do to influence his future outcome in life, he does. He does not take the drugs. He white knuckles what must have been a horrible experience in the hospital of not breaking his sobriety. And the way that the book ends, I think, is a hopeful one, where he has solved his issue. He is not going back. He's destined to become a crocodile like the other ones in his AA group. So I don't see it as a permanent thing. And that's where I would disagree with what you're saying. I do think you have a point about the Pale King offering a solution to some people who are sort of listless and lost. I think that the Pale King is also a response to where David Foster Wallace was at in his personal life. I think all of his work is about himself. And I don't mean that in a narcissistic way. I mean that all of his work is about him trying to deal with his own psyche and his own sort of state in life at any given time that he's writing something. This book is very obviously a culmination of a lot of the trauma and his own personal experiences with addiction and issues that he dealt with in his personal life up to the moment that it was released. The Pale King is very much about like trying to find meaning and square your sort of adult life with the need that you're going to have to work and give yourself over to another program. So I think it's reflective of where he was at. It's reflective of the fact that he felt like he had figured out sort of the right way to live. But he was still only 34 when this book came out. That's really fucking young.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that you could maybe do with a bit more thought on some of the argumentation of what he's saying about these characters. And I think that Joel Van Dyne or any of the other characters that kind of have a difficulty that we don't see them get past or not really evolve beyond. We don't know what ultimately happens to those characters, right? At least not in their entirety. We know some of them die. But I think that they are all depictions of different coping mechanisms and skills that people develop in order to avoid issues. You know, Joelle's choosing to wear the veil as a way to avoid the effect that she has on other people, rather than finding some sort of way to square herself with it, which is not dissimilar in philosophical import from what Randy Lenz does in the book. But I will say you've given me something to think about more than anything else. This is a very interesting email to kind of mull over. But yeah, I would encourage you to consider whether or not it is as final as you're kind of implying with a lot of those characters. I think that Pemulus is an interesting case of the Antichrist sort of comparison giving him short shrift, because even within the example that you're giving of him encouraging Hal to switch addictions, that is coming from someone who still wants to dose him with an incredibly potent drug that has the potential to destroy his mind. And if I don't remember if it's the exact same conversation that you're making reference to or if it's a different one, but he even advocates for the usage of the DMZ as a way to clear Hal's head, which is something that the devil would do. Here's something that has the potential to completely destroy your life to fix your life, but maybe it'll work. Like he does play a Antichrist seducer role in the book, and I think that that's really all Wallace is saying there. I don't think Wallace is trying to say that he is the Antichrist in like a literal sense. I think that he's in that interview he says that the book has multiple Antichrists and that Pemulus is one of them. And I mean, if you look at just the scene where he describes like how drug deals work with Pemulus, where he requires them to ask for it, that in and of itself, if you want to go down like a biblical theology rabbit hole, is also sort of how that is that the idea of Satan or Satan isn't that he makes you do anything, but it's that he offers a door and opens the door for you, but you need to walk in through it. He provides an opportunity. He tempts you, but you're the one who has to decide. And in forcing someone who asks him for drugs to say something like, "I'd like you to commit a crime," that is them explicitly asking for it, explicitly giving in to temptation. So I think that is much more of a artistic choice in how to depict the ways in which people get seduced into this, rather than an idea that Pemulus is sort of without character or without saving. I think it's a literary device more than anything else. That was a really long email. I'd love to keep talking with you. Sorry, a really long response to your email, not a really long email. I would love to keep talking to you about it. Please send us another one. But yeah, that's my thoughts. How about you, Cody? You have anything?
I don't want to sit here and say that Ben's wrong in his analysis of any of this. Just that I don't agree with it particularly.
Yeah.
I do agree in that I think that like Herbert Selby stuff, I mean, it's not my thing. I know there's people who like it, and that's fine. It's just not. I don't think it's as effective as something like Infinite Jest in dealing with addiction and the trauma of it, because there's more humanity in Infinite Jest and its characters. And like you said, there are people who want to break that cycle for the most part. And so I will gravitate towards those kind of books rather than the Selby kind of stuff. But there's something for everybody, and there's too much in the world to read, and we can't like all of it, and that's fine. But that being said, your analysis, even though I disagree with where you're going with it, I think it's well thought out, and I think you definitely have some good points. And there's no right or wrong really when you're talking about this kind of stuff. If you can defend your argument and you believe in it, and you can point to where it is in the book for you, that's awesome. I love that.
You're up next with Nick.
Yes. So we got an email from Nick. It says, hello again. I have recently been watching Twin Peaks: The Return, and it struck me that Agent Cooper is in many ways like the hero of inaction that Hal writes about in that one class paper. You could also say he is in a similar state to Hal at the beginning/end of Infinite Jest, although we really don't get to know what's going on in Cooper's head or if he's really, quote, in there. Anyways, would love to know what you think of that, since I know there's some Lynch heads on the pod. Hope you're all doing well, and I look forward to the next episode. Thanks, Nick. There are indeed some Lynch heads on this show. 2 of them are doing the show right now. I am also rewatching Twin Peaks. I'm watching it with my son. He's watching it for the first time. We haven't gotten to the return yet. I'm gonna keep my answer short, because we could do a whole separate show on Twin Peaks. That being said, I can see where you're coming from with the Agent Cooper thing, but I would disagree. I think for me, a lot of the purpose in The Return, and if you haven't watched The Return, I don't think I'm spoiling anything, because I don't really think it can be spoiled. I don't think Cooper is an agent or a hero of inaction. I think he's doing too much, and I think that's kind of the point of the last few episodes of the show, is when he gets to the point that he physically interacts with Laura on the night of her murder, and then she disappears. I think that's his realization that no matter what he does, he can't intervene in a way to prevent what happened from happening, because it had to. It was sort of, not to say predetermined, but you can't alter the past in that kind of a way. And I think despite his best efforts to do so, that was the universe telling him, you can't do this. And now you're just going to have to relive the cycle again. So there is the cyclical nature of it, but I don't think he is a hero of inaction. I think he is a hero of overaction, if anything.
I can't add anything to that. Or this is still emails, right?
Yeah, we got one more. This one actually just came in yesterday. It got thrown into our spam folder, and I just happened to check it
nice.
like while we were recording. So yeah.
From Michael, who says, I'm just now getting to your April 30th IJ episode. Isn't Hal tricking himself into doing the work of grieving, similar to how AA works for many of the people for whom it works, following the steps? That was what we were talking about. We were sort of having a conversation about like whether we thought that's what he was doing. I think that is what he's doing. I think that he basically tricked himself into having an actual grief experience. Because if I'm not mistaken, did I do my comparison to a terrible book about an anxious person who tricks her therapist into giving her anti-anxiety medication? I might have.
I don't remember.
But there was a book we did at a book club I attend that I did not like, but there was one really funny portion of it where this narrator is like the most anxious head I've had to live in ever, as far as a character for a book goes. And then at one point in the book, she goes to a therapist and gets prescribed Ativan. And she has this sort of aside where she's like, ha 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 ha, I tricked that therapist into giving me drugs. And that's, I think, the same thing that Hal is doing. He's managed to gaslight himself into thinking that he's beyond grief, but what he's actually just doing is grieving.
Yeah. So next up, we have a few YouTube comments. 3 of them are from Matthew Cracker 6729. Don't know if the first 6,728 Matthew Crackers were taken, but this is 6,729. Number 1, page 400. I don't know why I find this so funny, but Wallace singles out the miniature golf headline as being among the obvious phony headlines featured in Mario's puppet film, while it's actually one of the more normal ones in the lineup. That one, it's on $3.99 for my edition of the book. And the headline is just Canadian PM denies secret miniature golf outing with outraged New England governors. Surprisingly small third page 10-point header. It is funny as hell, and it really is actually one of the more normal headlines that comes up, because at some point it becomes President Gentle just using it as a means of getting snarky with other people that he disagrees with. So
Yeah.
it's great. Number 2, curious what you think about this. The whole thing about IJ being unfilmable, I think, has a lot of truth to it. I certainly think if any kind of attempt of it were ever to be made, it would have to be done with the utmost care and responsible craft. The only way I could see it being done is perhaps like a kind of Twin Peaks to Return style miniseries. But do you think something like the IJ fan trailer purposes a kind of template that could be used to make little short segments based on portions of the book? Just a little short about Clipperton, or just a little short depicting a Madame Psychosis broadcast, or even something that portrays itself as the JOI's joke, the actual film? Just little segments that are done really well and responsibly, like the fan trailer, and work as a standalone, but also that leave this kind of feeling of this is only a piece of something that has the potential to be told as a whole. I think there's a lot of potential here. Do I think that I think if we had to have a filmed version of Infinite Jest, it would have to be a miniseries. That being said, I don't want to sit here and say it's unfilmable. I think it doesn't lend itself to being filmed. I think that it exists in the format in which it exists because that is the right format to tell the story. I think too often there's this like inclination to want to have things translated to film. I see it constantly comes up on the Pinch on subreddit, right, where everyone does their fan casting of Gravity's Rainbow, or what director do you think could do Gravity's Rainbow? We've done it too. We're just as guilty of it, talking about it with like Mason and Dixon and Vineland and everything like that. But I genuinely don't think this book needs to be filmed. I think it exists in the perfect medium, and it needs to just stay there.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a Blood Meridian thing. You could make a Blood Meridian movie. It probably would not be very good because that book does not lend itself particularly well to film. I think you could make an Infinite Jest miniseries. Nothing in the book is impossible enough to film. It doesn't have an adenoid problem like a Gravity's Rainbow adaptation would. But I don't think something would be lost in that translation, to your point, because non-chronological stuff, to the degree that Infinite Jest is harder to do in film in a coherent way. And I mean, you can look at just the first season of that Witcher TV show that Netflix did, which was super non-chronological. People lost their mind about it and were like not able to follow the way that the show unfolded. But I think the other thing is, like, so much of this book is textural narration. Like, you can film the Boston AA segment. You will not get the same thing out of it as you will reading it, because so much of it is, again, that like textural narration telling you these truths about AA, where if you were to actually film what's happening on the page, it would not at all be interesting. And so you'd have to find a way to kind of smash those together. I do think that the best way to go about it would be to adapt certain sequences. The Clipperton sequence, which we neglected to talk about, but is a great illustration of Mario as a good human being, would be one of those. The Decemberists, with their music video for their song Calamity Song, which adapts the Eschaton sequence from the book. That's been done. So I think that there are ways to go about recreating certain scenes of it. You could certainly kind of create a faux puppet show movie if you wanted to adapt that portion of this book, or of this chunk that we read. So I think that if you were going to do it at all, that would probably have to be the way to do it. And I think it would have to come from sort of real fans of the material. I don't think you're going to be very successful unless you really sort of know this material like down in your bone marrow. Which is why Michael Schur, who owns the film rights to Infinite Jest now, is the one who directed that music video for the Decemberists.
Makes sense, yeah.
Yeah, he is somebody who really understands this material. I think that if anyone could adapt it, it would probably be him. But according to him, he has the film rights specifically so that no one makes a movie out of it.
Good. I love that.
So, and he wrote his graduate thesis on Infinite Jest. He wrote like a sort of a philosophy or self-help book a couple years ago that essentially has the same cover as Infinite Jest. He's a real Infinite Jest guy.
And then the last thing that Matthew Cracker 6729 said, always picture Jeffrey Day as Dick Tremaine from Twin Peaks. I didn't before, but I do now, and I hate it. I hate that ascot wearing, cigarette stick smoking motherfucker so much.
I could definitely see that. Yeah.
Oh my god, he's Dick Tremaine, and I'm gonna keep myself from going on a tangent about season 2 of Twin Peaks. Dick Tremaine is one of those characters that, like, he's not the worst part of season 2, but he's far from the best part of it too.
That's true. That's true. The worst of season 2 is James singing that song.
Oh yeah, the Just You song.
Yeah,
The most uncomfortable 2 minutes of anybody's life.
It's terrible. That was the moment when I was having a really serious identity crisis about whether or not I had been tricked in some way.
Yeah, I that's actually the last episode my son and I watched, and I remember, like, I was looking at him every now and then, like, what is he gonna think of it? And he just sat there and watched it. And he likes James a lot. And look, don't get me wrong, I like James. James is fine. That was an uncomfortable scene. And then this, I promise, is the end of my diatribe against season 2. I love the show. I really do. But the whole side story of James working for the lady whose husband has a bunch of cars and she kills him is just asinine and doesn't work. It doesn't belong in the show. You could cut every part of that out and it would not make a difference whatsoever. End of rant.
Lastly, we did get another message from Reddit user All Right Time, who says, "Your May 1st episode, you two are doing a great job of introducing the book to new readers exactly as you'd intended. I just want to address a near universal misunderstanding that you've both fallen into, however, and now unfortunately propagated. Wallace only mentioned the book's Sierpinski gasket structure once to Michael Silverblatt, as you'd noted, but he didn't explain what it meant, only that it had wound up lopsided due to cuts. The Sierpinski gasket is just a fractalized equilateral triangle, so as a novel composed of narrative language obviously won't be a precise mathematical figure, but only a conceptual approximation. An equilateral triangle has 3 equal sides, of course, which implies that the book originally had 3 equal narratives, which then got unevenly cut during editing. Readers hopefully recognize that the novel's focus is addiction, as an escape from despair and sadness. One of the 3 narratives is clearly Hal's, at ETA and addicted to marijuana. Another is clearly Gately's, at Ended House and addicted to narcotics. Because the novel's other big setting is the terrorists and government search for the entertainment, a lot of readers understandably assume that it's the 3rd narrative, but it's not. They aren't addicted to the entertainment themselves, but are attempting to either further or prevent others' addiction to it, something which also occurs in the novel's other 2 addiction narratives. The 3rd addiction narrative is actually James and Candenza's addiction to both alcohol and creating his priapistic entertainment. His filmmaking career had been focused on creating ever more effective or addicting iterations of the film for himself, but by year of dependent adult undergarment, the concern is simply the search for it. All of these 3 addicts' narratives contain the same recursive elements, but most of the late scenes to be cut involve James and Candenza's childhood and current activities, leading the novel to be lopsided. So why is this important? AA's well-known symbol is an equilateral triangle within a circle, representing unity as God. The 3 sides of the triangle represent the physical, the mental, and the spiritual components of addiction and recovery. In the novel, Hal's Tennis Academy-based narrative is obviously the physical, James and Candenza's MIT originating narrative is obviously the mental, and Gately's Halfway House-based narrative is obviously focused on AA's spiritual element. Wallace famously said that, "There is an ending as far as I'm concerned. Certain kind of parallel lines are supposed to start converging in such a way that an end can be projected by the reader somewhere beyond the right frame. If no such convergence or projection occurred to you, then the book's failed for you." Clearly, the novel's 3 distinct parallel addiction narratives, James, Hal's, and Gately's, come together after the novel's final page to find God corresponding to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Personally, I don't agree with Wallace's conclusion, but it obviously made for a compelling novel. Don't overlook that Wallace's life had been forever changed by following AA's 12 steps. They're not ambiguous. Read them for yourself. Then attending both meetings in church for the rest of his life. Infinite Jest was Wallace's step 12. 12. Having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. I appreciate the color that you added there. I do think that you are correct in especially the intertextuality of this book with AA and with Wallace's own recovery journey. I do think that it is worth examining whether or not the book, from a functional perspective, in terms of, like you're talking about with editing, and in terms of the time spent in different locations in the book, maps pretty cleanly to the version of the gasket that we gave on the show. Now, of course, I'm not beholden to any of it. Wallace himself mentions in that interview with Silverblatt, as we have both sort of made reference to, that the initial draft, that like 1,700 page draft, somewhat resembled this structure. So it's all working pretty nebulously around that. I think that in terms of looking at, and what I was trying to communicate in that previous episode, I think in terms of looking at how it is most expedient to the reader to break down the way that the book is structured, from the perspective of these are the locales, these are the characters, here's how they keep getting reintegrated and broken down further, that it is more expedient in explanation to map to those three different locations or those three different storylines. I do think that if you're looking at it from a thematic perspective or a spiritual perspective, then a lot of that is most likely true based upon what you said. I don't necessarily disagree with that. But I think that especially once you get into the fact that that structure is not really surviving to the version of the book that we have access to, and that, like you mentioned, in what got cut out, is pretty hard to reconstruct, that doesn't create the greatest lens to look at it from. But I do think you're absolutely correct in terms of how these things map to different elements of the recovery process, and how those individually end up moving out through the rest of the book through those three principal characters.
I don't have anything to add to that. I think you were the better person to answer that question than me. So that's where it is.
All right, so that brings us to the end of our program. Next month, we're going to be reading from page 410 through to 503. So all of the paginations should be the same, but if for some reason your pagination is not the same, we are ending at the page break on 503, where the last sentence is, "This was how I first became interested in the possibilities of annulation." If you like what you're doing and you want to support the show, please consider making a donation on our Ko-Fi. Any funds that we receive will be used to upgrade our equipment and pay hosting fees and just generally help make the show better. It has already been an immense help to us in prepping for not just this show, but in also prepping for all of the work that we're doing with Pinch On. And we love to be able to use those funds to pay back into the content that you are donating to in the first place. We do not make any money off of this show at all. If, however, you would like something in exchange for your donation, you can purchase merch from us at our spread shop. There is an Infinite Jest t-shirt on there that was designed by Luke, one of the co-hosts on the main program. And then we do also have plenty of merch available with just the show's logo on it. And if you, like one of our many lovely listeners who got in touch with us over the past month, want to get in touch with us this coming month, you can do so in a number of different ways. We are available by email at mappingthezonepod@gmail.com. You can reach out to us on Blue Sky at mappingthezone. We are on Twitter at PinchOnPod. We are on Instagram at mappingthezonepodcast. And who knows? Maybe if there's a TikTok opportunity. I'm just kidding. We're not going to do that. Those are the places that you can reach out to us. Email is certainly going to be the most expedient, but we will eventually get notifications on any of those platforms. And until next time, thank you so much for listening.
Bye.